Right now, somewhere in the world, a computer is being infected. Not by something physical, not by something you can see, hear or touch, by pure mathematics. Think about that. A sequence of ones and zeros arranged in a specific order is capable of destroying a nation's nuclear program. A sequence of ones and zeros can steal every password you have ever typed. A sequence of ones and zeros can lock every file on your computer, encrypt your wedding photos, your tax documents, your entire digital existence, and then demand money to give it back. And here is the part that nobody talks about. The people who write these things are not necessarily criminal masterminds working in dark basements. Some of them work for governments. Some of them have university degrees in computer science. Some of them are, in every measurable way, ordinary people who learned how to weaponize mathematics. A computer virus is not a metaphor. When scientists first started using that word in the 1980s, they meant it almost literally. A computer virus behaves like a biological virus in ways that are not accidental. It finds a host. It injects its code. It replicates, it spreads. And it does all of this often while you are sitting right in front of the screen, completely unaware. But here is the question that nobody fully explains. How does it actually work? Not the vague outline, not the simplified version. How does a sequence of code arriving on your machine as a file, an email attachment, a link on a web page, actually transform itself from something passive and inert into something that takes control of your computer, hides from your antivirus software, replicates itself into other files, contacts remote servers, steals your data, and in some cases physically destroys hardware? How does math become a weapon? That is what this documentary is about. We are going to start at the very beginning with the first experiments in the 1950s that accidentally created the intellectual foundation for every virus ever written. We are going to go inside the actual mechanics of how code infects other code. We are going to examine the three core components of a virus: the infection mechanism, the trigger, and the payload, and explain each one in precise technical detail using language that any person can follow. We are going to look at the most destructive viruses ever unleashed on the world, including one that caused physical destruction at a nuclear facility without a single soldier crossing a single border. We are going to explore how viruses hide, how they evolve, how they outsmart software designed specifically to kill them, and where this entire arms race is heading now that artificial intelligence has entered the equation. By the end of this documentary, you will understand something that most people on this planet never think about. The computers running the world, the machines controlling power grids, hospitals, financial systems, nuclear reactors, military networks, are all running software. And software, by its very nature, can be infected. The question is not whether that matters. The question is whether you understand how it happens before it happens to you. Chapter 1. What is a computer, really? Before we can understand what a virus does to a computer, we need to understand what a computer actually is at its most fundamental level. Because most people interact with computers through pictures, buttons, icons and menus, and that surface layer hides what is actually happening underneath. A computer, at its core, is a machine that processes instructions. Those instructions are written in a language made entirely of 2 digits, 0 and 1, off and on. That is it. Every piece of software on your computer, every application, every operating system, every driver, every file is ultimately a sequence of zeros and ones. When you click a button on your screen, that click is translated into a series of instructions, which are translated into zeros and ones, which are interpreted by the processor, which is a physical chip that can execute billions of these tiny instructions every single second. Now, here is the key concept that makes viruses possible. In a computer, the line between data and instructions is not fixed. That is a sentence worth reading twice. In a computer, the line between data and instructions is not fixed. When your computer loads a document file, it treats that file as data. It reads the zeros and ones and interprets them as text, as formatting, as images. But what happens if someone places executable code, actual instructions, inside what looks like a document? What happens if a file that your computer expects to be harmless data is actually carrying instructions that tell the processor to do something else entirely? That is the crack in the wall. That is where viruses live. To understand this properly, we need to go through the basic architecture of how a computer handles programs. When you run a program on your computer, several things happen in sequence. First, the operating system loads the program file from your storage drive into memory. Memory, also called RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory, is a temporary workspace where the processor can access data extremely fast. The processor then reads the instructions from memory and executes them one by one. The operating system is the software layer that sits between you and the hardware. It is the program that runs everything else. On most personal computers, this is Microsoft Windows. On Apple computers, it is Mac OS. On servers and many other devices, it is Linux. The operating system manages memory, controls access to hardware, handles files, and critically, it decides what code is allowed to execute and with what level of permission. Every modern operating system has what computer scientists call a privilege hierarchy. At the top is what is known as kernel mode. The kernel is the core of the operating system. It runs with complete, unrestricted access to every part of the hardware. Below that is user mode. Programs you run as a normal user operate in user mode. They have limited access to system resources and cannot directly interfere with the kernel or other programs. This distinction matters enormously, because a virus that runs only in user mode is limited in what it can do. It can damage files accessible to your user account. It can steal data your account can read. But it cannot, in principle, take over the entire system. A virus that manages to run in kernel mode, on the other hand, owns the machine completely. It can hide from the operating system itself. It can intercept any function, read any data, modify any file, and do it all while the operating system reports that everything is normal. Getting from user mode to kernel mode is one of the central technical goals of advanced malware. and it is something we will come back to in detail. There is another concept that is absolutely essential to understand before we go further. It is called an executable file. On Windows computers, executable files typically end in the letters .exe. An executable file is a file that contains machine code, which is the sequence of instructions that the processor can directly run. When you double-click an .exe file, you are telling the operating system to load those instructions into memory and start executing them. But here is where things get more complicated. Not all dangerous code lives in .exe files. Documents can contain something called macros, which are small programs embedded inside the document itself. Web pages can contain scripts written in the JavaScript programming language that execute inside your browser. Images, PDF files, video files, even audio files have at various points in the history of computing contained exploitable code. The reason comes down to a simple principle. Whenever software reads and processes a file, there is code handling that file. And that code, if it has bugs, can be tricked. A bug in the code that reads a file is called a vulnerability. A vulnerability in software that the software's creators do not yet know about is called a zero-day vulnerability. It is called that because from the moment it is discovered by an attacker, the developers have had 0 days to prepare a fix. Zero-day vulnerabilities are extraordinarily valuable. Nation-states buy and sell them. Criminal organizations use them. The most sophisticated viruses ever created have relied on them. Now let us talk about what actually happens when code executes. The processor in your computer executes instructions from something called the instruction set. Each type of processor has its own instruction set, which is essentially the vocabulary of operations it can perform. These include arithmetic operations like addition and multiplication. They include logical operations like comparing two values. They include memory operations like loading a value from memory or storing a value to memory. And they include control flow operations like jumping to a different location in the instruction sequence. That last category, control flow, is where so many vulnerabilities come from. When a program is running, the processor keeps track of where it is in the instruction sequence using a special register called the instruction pointer. A register is an extremely small but extremely fast piece of memory built directly into the processor. The instruction pointer holds the address in memory of the next instruction to execute. If an attacker can change the value of the instruction pointer, they can redirect the processor to execute whatever code they want. This is the technical basis for an entire class of attacks called control flow hijacking. And it is the basis of some of the most important exploitation techniques ever discovered. We will come back to this when we discuss how viruses actually infect systems. Now, one more fundamental concept. Every piece of data your computer processes, every character you type, every pixel on your screen, every number in a spreadsheet is stored in memory as a sequence of binary digits, which are the zeros and ones we mentioned. 8 binary digits form a group called a byte. A byte can represent 256 different values from 0 to 255. 1024 bytes form a kilobyte. 1024 kilobytes form a megabyte. 1024 megabytes form a gigabyte. When scientists talk about a virus being 500 kilobytes in size, as with the Stuxnet worm we will examine in detail later, they are talking about 500 times 1024 bytes, which is 512,000 bytes, which is 4,096,000 bits, each bit being a single 0 or 1. That 500 kilobytes of code was enough to destroy physical industrial machinery. The power of a computer virus does not come from its size. It comes from what the code does and when. Chapter 2. The birth of the idea, from theory to first infection. The story of computer viruses does not begin with a criminal. It begins with mathematics. In 1949, a mathematician and computer scientist named John von Neumann gave a series of lectures at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Von Neumann was already one of the most important thinkers in the history of computing. He had helped design the architecture that nearly every modern computer still uses, an architecture so fundamental that it is simply called the von Neumann architecture. But in these lectures he began exploring a question that was purely theoretical. Could a machine reproduce itself? Von Neumann formally described what he called a self-reproducing automaton, which is a formal mathematical system that could make copies of itself. His description was abstract. He was not thinking about malicious code. He was thinking about the theoretical foundations of life and computation. But the mathematics he laid out, the idea that a program could contain within itself the instructions for copying itself, is the exact mathematical foundation on which every computer virus ever written is built. More than a decade later, in 1961, a group of programmers at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey were building one of the most important early computers, a machine called the IBM 7090. After hours, a small group of them invented a game. They called it Core Wars. The game was this. Each player would write a small program. Both programs would be loaded into the computer's memory. The goal was to write your program so that it survived, replicated, and ultimately destroyed the other player's program by overwriting it with garbage. The game was played in secret because the programmers knew their employers would not approve. It was purely intellectual sport. But it was, in every meaningful technical sense, the first arena where self-replicating adversarial programs competed against each other. Core Wars was not a computer virus in the modern sense, but it demonstrated something important. Programs could be designed to seek out and interact with other programs in memory. Programs could be designed to replicate, and programs could be designed to destroy. The next step came in 1971 on a computer network called ARPANET. ARPANET was the direct ancestor of the Internet. It was a network of computers connected together, originally funded by the United States Department of Defense to enable communication between research institutions. In 1971, a programmer named Bob Thomas, working at a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, wrote an experimental self-replicating program for the DEC PDP-10 computer. He called it Creeper. Creeper is historically recognized as the first known self-replicating program to spread through a computer network. It was not malicious. It moved from machine to machine on ARPANET and displayed a message that read, "I am the Creeper. Catch me if you can." It did not damage files. It did not steal data. But it spread by itself from machine to machine without human intervention beyond the initial execution. In response, a programmer named Ray Tomlinson, who later became famous as the inventor of email, wrote a program called Reaper. Reaper's only purpose was to chase Creeper through the network and delete it. Tomlinson had, without fully intending to, invented the first antivirus program. The arms race had begun. For the next decade, self-replicating programs remained largely theoretical curiosities. Computers were expensive, networks were limited. The average person had no personal computer. But then the 1980s arrived, and everything changed. In 1981, the Apple II personal computer was spreading rapidly through homes and offices across America. A 15-year-old high school student in Texas named Richard Skrenta wrote a program that spread through Apple II computers via the floppy disks that were, at that time, the standard way to share software. The program was called Elk Cloner. It attached itself to the boot sector of floppy disks. The boot sector is the first part of a disk that the computer reads when it starts up. When someone inserted an infected floppy disk and booted their computer, Elk Cloner would load into memory. Then, every time the computer subsequently accessed another floppy disk, it would copy itself to that disk as well. Elk Cloner was not dangerous. It displayed a poem on every 50th boot of an infected machine. The poem included the lines, "It will get on all your disks. It will infiltrate your chips. Yes, it's Cloner." But the technical mechanism Elk Cloner used was real. The concept of infecting the boot sector of a disk so that the virus loads before the operating system, before anything else on the computer, is still used by malware today. The following year, in 1982, a graduate student at the University of Southern California named Fred Cohen was studying computer security. He wrote a program that could, as he described it, infect other programs by modifying them to include a possibly evolved copy of itself. Cohen presented his experiment to a computer security course taught by Professor Len Adelman. Adelman, who later became famous as one of the inventors of the RSA encryption algorithm, was the one who suggested calling Cohen's program a computer virus, drawing the parallel to biological viruses. Cohen then went on to write the first formal academic paper defining and analyzing computer viruses. The word and the concept had officially entered the scientific literature. What Cohen's academic work demonstrated was not just that viruses were possible. His mathematical proof demonstrated something much more disturbing. He proved that detecting a computer virus in the general case is an undecidable problem. This is a precise mathematical statement with a precise meaning. It means that there is no algorithm, no computer program that can be written that will correctly determine whether an arbitrary piece of software is or is not a virus for every possible case. This is not a technological limitation that we will overcome when computers get faster. It is a mathematical impossibility provable from first principles, in the same category as Turing's halting problem. Antivirus software can get better. It can catch more viruses, but it will never catch all viruses with certainty, because mathematics says it cannot. The implications of this result are staggering, and most people who use computers every day have never heard of it. The antivirus software on your computer is not a perfect shield. It is, at its mathematical foundation, an approximation. A very good approximation, but an approximation nonetheless. In 1986, the first virus to attack IBM personal computers, the machines that were by then dominating offices around the world, appeared. It was called Brain. It was written by two brothers, Basit and Amjad Farooq Alvi, who ran a computer store in Lahore, Pakistan. Their stated motivation was to protect their software from piracy. Brain infected the boot sector of floppy disks and included a message with the brothers' names, address and phone number, inviting victims to contact them about the virus. When people actually did call, the brothers were reportedly surprised that the virus had spread so far. It had reached the United States, the United Kingdom, and beyond. Brain is significant not because it was destructive, but because it introduced a stealth technique. When the operating system tried to read the infected boot sector of a floppy disk, Brain would intercept the request and return the original clean boot sector instead of the infected one. This is one of the first documented examples of what security researchers call stealth technology in malware. The virus was actively hiding its own presence from the system. This one idea that a virus can intercept system calls and lie about what it is doing has been refined and expanded over the following 4 decades into an entire discipline of evasion that modern malware uses to extraordinary effect. But in 1986, it was new, and it changed the game. The Morris worm of 1988 was the next major watershed. Robert Tappan Morris, a graduate student at Cornell University, released a program onto the Internet on the 2nd of November 1988. Morris intended the program as an experiment to measure the size of the Internet. He made a mistake in the code. The worm spread far faster than he intended and began crashing thousands of computers. It exploited multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously, including a buffer overflow vulnerability in the SendMail program, a debugging backdoor in the Fingered program, and a trust relationship exploitation in the RSH and RegSec services. We will discuss buffer overflow vulnerabilities in detail in a later chapter because they remain to this day one of the most important classes of vulnerability that viruses exploit. For now, what matters is the scale of the Morris worm's effect. It infected an estimated 6,000 computers, which at the time represented a significant fraction of the entire Internet. At a time when a computer costing hundreds of thousands of dollars was not unusual, the total damage was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. Morris became the first person prosecuted under the United States Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. He was convicted, fined $10,000, sentenced to 3 years of probation, and required to perform 400 hours of community service. The Morris worm introduced the world to the concept of a network worm, a program that does not need to attach itself to other files or wait for a user to copy an infected disk. Instead, it spreads automatically over a network, exploiting vulnerabilities in network services to jump from machine to machine without any human intervention at all. The distinction between a virus and a worm is a technical one that matters. A virus requires a host file. It inserts its code into another program, a document, a boot sector. When the host runs, the virus runs. A worm is self-sufficient. It is a complete standalone program that spreads on its own, typically exploiting network vulnerabilities. In practice, modern malware often combines characteristics of both, along with other components. The word virus has come to be used colloquially for all malicious software, which is why we use it throughout this documentary, but the technical distinction is real and matters for understanding how these programs work. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, computer viruses had gone from theoretical curiosities to a genuine global problem. The first antivirus software products were being sold commercially. The first computer security companies were being founded. And the arms race between malware writers and malware defenders had begun in earnest. Chapter 3. Anatomy of a virus. The 3 components. Every computer virus ever written, from the simplest 1 kilobyte program to the most sophisticated nation-state cyber weapon ever created, shares the same 3 fundamental components: the infection mechanism, the trigger, and the payload. Understanding these 3 components is understanding the entire architecture of a computer virus. Everything else, the specific techniques, the particular vulnerabilities exploited, the methods of evasion, the damage caused, all of it is an elaboration on these 3 things. Let us begin with the infection mechanism. The infection mechanism is how the virus spreads from one host to another. In biological viruses, this might be airborne transmission, contact transmission, or vector transmission through an insect bite. In computer viruses, the infection mechanism is a method for inserting the virus's code into other executable content so that the virus runs whenever that content runs. The most basic infection mechanism is file infection. The virus finds executable files on the infected system and inserts its code into them. When the user later runs one of those files, the virus code executes first, or alongside the original program. The user sees the original program run normally. They do not know the virus has also executed. There are several ways a virus can insert itself into a file. The simplest is to prepend, meaning to place the virus code at the beginning of the file. When the file executes, the virus code runs first, does whatever it needs to do, and then passes control to the original program. The user sees the original program start up normally and notices nothing unusual. A more sophisticated approach is to append the virus code to the end of the file. In this case, the virus also modifies the beginning of the file, inserting a small jump instruction that redirects execution to the virus code at the end, which then runs and then jumps back to the original entry point of the program. This is harder to detect visually because the beginning of the file looks the same, but slightly more complex to implement correctly. The most sophisticated approach is to insert the virus code into cavities within the file. Executable files are not solid blocks of code. They have a structure with multiple sections, and between sections there are often gaps, areas of unused space filled with zeros. A cavity virus finds these gaps and inserts its code there. The result is a virus that does not change the overall size of the infected file, which makes it significantly harder to detect by methods that check file sizes. Boot sector infection is a different class of infection mechanism. The boot sector is the first sector of a storage device, whether a floppy disk, a hard drive, or a USB drive. When a computer starts, its firmware, the low-level software built into the hardware itself, reads the boot sector and executes whatever code it finds there. This happens before the operating system loads. A boot sector virus places itself in this location. The result is that the virus executes before anything else, including before any security software. It loads into memory before the operating system, which gives it extraordinary power. It can modify how the operating system loads. It can intercept operating system calls from the very beginning. It is in a position of total control. Macro viruses take a completely different approach. They infect documents rather than programs. Many document formats, most infamously early versions of Microsoft Word and Excel, include support for macros, which are small programs embedded inside the document that automate tasks. A macro virus inserts malicious macro code into a document file. When the document is opened, the macros automatically execute, and the virus has a chance to run. Macro viruses became enormously successful in the mid-1990s because the macros in Microsoft Office ran with the same permissions as the user, meaning they could read and modify files, send emails, and access network resources. Network propagation is the mechanism used by worms rather than traditional viruses, but it is worth understanding in detail because the most destructive malware incidents in history have used it. A network worm includes code for scanning other machines on a network and attempting to exploit vulnerabilities in their network services. A network service is any software on a computer that is listening for incoming network connections, waiting to perform some service for other computers. A web server is a network service. An email server is a network service. A file-sharing service is a network service. Any of these, if they contain vulnerabilities, can be exploited by a worm to gain a foothold on that machine and continue spreading. Email propagation became extremely important in the 1990s and remains relevant today. A virus that spreads via email does not necessarily exploit a vulnerability in the email software itself. Often it relies on social engineering, which is the technical term for manipulating a human being into taking an action they would not otherwise take. An email that appears to come from a trusted colleague asking the recipient to open an attached file is social engineering. The technical barrier is low. The human psychological barrier is the real challenge. And it turns out that human beings are extremely vulnerable to well-crafted deception. The I Love You virus of the year 2000 is one of the clearest examples of social engineering combined with technical execution. The email arrived with the subject line, "I love you." The attachment was labelled "Love Letter for You, txt.vbs." The final file extension VBS indicated this was a Visual Basic script, a programming language built into Windows. But Windows, at that time, hid known file extensions from users. So the file appeared to be named Love Letter for You, txt, which looked like a plain text document. Millions of people opened it. The script executed, overwrote image, audio and document files with copies of itself, stole passwords, and emailed itself to every address in the victim's email address book. Within hours, it had infected an estimated 45 million computers worldwide. The psychological trigger was powerful. Love letters are private and irresistible. The technical deception was clever. Hiding the real file extension exploited a default Windows behavior. And the propagation mechanism, emailing every contact in the victim's address book, was brutally efficient. The I Love You virus caused an estimated $10 billion in damage. Now let us move to the second component, the trigger. The trigger is the condition that determines when the virus activates its payload. A virus that immediately causes damage upon infection is inefficient and easily detected. If your computer starts behaving strangely the moment you open an infected file, you notice. You investigate. You might contain the infection before it spreads. A much more effective strategy is to remain dormant during an initial infection phase, spreading as widely as possible while causing no noticeable damage, and then activate all at once when a specific condition is met. This maximizes the damage and minimizes the opportunity for early detection. Triggers can be based on time. A virus might be programmed to activate on a specific date. The Michelangelo virus, discovered in 1991, was programmed to activate on the 6th of March every year, which was the birthday of the Renaissance artist Michelangelo. On that date, if the virus was present on a computer, it would overwrite the boot sectors of the hard drive with garbage data, making the system unbootable. Media coverage of the virus before its activation date in 1992 was intense. Many organizations scrambled to scan and clean their systems. When the 6th of March arrived, the actual damage was limited, but the potential had been real. Triggers can also be based on events within the system. A virus might activate only when the user opens a specific application, such as a banking application or a security tool. It might activate when a specific file is accessed. It might activate when the system connects to a specific network. It might activate after it has been installed on a certain number of machines, ensuring widespread infection before causing damage. Some of the most sophisticated triggers involve environmental checks. A virus might check for the presence of a specific file or registry key before activating, ensuring it only runs in a specific environment. It might check the language settings of the operating system. It might check the host name of the computer. The Stuxnet worm, which we will examine in detail in a later chapter, had extraordinarily specific triggers designed to ensure it would only cause damage on specific types of industrial control systems running specific software configurations. Everything else it infected, and Stuxnet infected tens of thousands of computers around the world, it left completely untouched. This selectivity is not just tactically sophisticated. It has legal and strategic implications. If a cyber weapon is designed to cause damage only to specific systems while leaving everything else unharmed, the argument can be made, technically at least, that it is a targeted weapon rather than an indiscriminate one. Whether that argument holds up under international law is a question that is still being debated. Now, the third component, the payload. The payload is what the virus actually does. This is the malicious purpose it was designed to serve. Payloads are extraordinarily varied. They range from the trivially annoying to the physically destructive. The simplest payloads are purely disruptive. Early viruses often displayed messages, played sounds, or made text on the screen appear to fall to the bottom like rain. These were demonstrations of capability more than genuine attacks. The virus was saying, in effect, "I was here." More destructive payloads include file deletion and corruption. A virus might delete specific types of files, such as documents or images. It might overwrite files with random garbage, making them unrecoverable. It might corrupt the boot sector of the hard drive, making the computer unable to start. The CIH virus, also known as the Chernobyl virus, discovered in 1998, took this to an extreme. On the 26th of April each year, the anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, it attempted to overwrite the first megabyte of the hard drive with garbage, destroying the partition table and making the drive unreadable. On some systems, it went further, attempting to overwrite the contents of the flash BIOS, the firmware chip on the motherboard that contains the code the computer needs to start up at all. On machines where this succeeded, the computer would not start, could not be booted from any source, and required a hardware repair or chip replacement to function again. CIH caused an estimated $1 billion in damage. Data theft payloads focus on extracting sensitive information. A virus with a data theft payload will search the infected system for valuable data, including stored passwords, browser history, credit card numbers, banking credentials, private documents, and email contacts. This data is then transmitted to servers controlled by the attacker. The user may never know this has happened. The computer continues to function normally. The only sign that something is wrong might be a small amount of extra network traffic, which most users never monitor. Ransomware is a payload category that has become dominant over the last decade. A ransomware payload encrypts the victim's files, making them inaccessible without the encryption key. The key is held by the attacker. The victim is then presented with a demand. Pay money, typically in cryptocurrency, to make the payment untraceable and receive the key. Do not pay and lose your files forever. Modern ransomware attacks have targeted hospitals, where encrypted medical records can quite literally cost lives. They have targeted power utilities, water treatment facilities, financial institutions, and government agencies. According to Verizon's data breach investigation report covering incidents analyzed up to 2024, ransomware was involved in 44% of all data breaches. Remote access payloads, often called remote access Trojans or RATs, give an attacker persistent control over the infected machine. The attacker can remotely activate the webcam, record keystrokes, take screenshots, execute any command as if they were sitting at the keyboard, copy any file. These tools are used by intelligence agencies, criminal organizations, and individual stalkers. They are extraordinarily invasive. Botnet payloads turn the infected machine into one node in a large network of compromised computers called a botnet, which stands for Robot Network. The attacker commands the botnet, sending instructions to thousands or millions of infected computers simultaneously. Botnets are used to send spam email, to conduct denial-of-service attacks that overwhelm websites with traffic until they crash, to mine cryptocurrency using the victim's electricity and computing power, and to serve as infrastructure for other attacks. The owner of the computer has no idea their machine is part of a criminal network. Their electricity is being consumed, their internet bandwidth is being used, and they are unknowingly participating in attacks against third parties. The most devastating payloads are those that target physical infrastructure. This is where the story of computer viruses becomes something far more alarming than a nuisance. When a virus can destroy physical equipment, when code can cause hardware to fail, when a program can rupture a pipeline or crash a power grid or spin a centrifuge until it tears itself apart, the line between cyber attack and physical attack becomes very thin indeed. We will examine this in detail in the chapter on Stuxnet, but the principle is worth stating now. Modern industrial equipment is controlled by computers. Those computers run software. That software can be infected, and a payload designed with sufficient knowledge of the target's industrial systems can cause those systems to operate in ways that damage or destroy the physical hardware. This is not hypothetical. It has already happened, and it will happen again. Chapter 4. How a virus infects. The technical mechanics. Now we go deeper. We have described what the three components of a virus are. But describing what something is and explaining how it actually works at a technical level are two very different things. In this chapter, we are going to explain the actual mechanics of how a virus infects a computer. We're going to discuss specific classes of vulnerability, specific techniques, and specific mechanisms in enough detail that by the end you will understand not just that viruses work, but precisely why and how. Let us start with the concept of execution flow. When a program runs on a computer, the processor moves through the program's instructions in sequence. This sequence is called the execution flow. A program can change its execution flow by using jump instructions that redirect the processor to a different point in the code, or by calling functions, which are reusable blocks of code that perform specific tasks. When a function is called, the processor saves its current position in memory so it can return to it when the function finishes. then jumps to the function's code. When the function returns, the processor reads back the saved position and continues from where it left off. The saved position, the return address, is stored in a region of memory called the stack. The stack is a structured region of memory that programs use for temporary storage. It holds return addresses, local variables, and function arguments. It grows and shrinks as functions are called and return. Now, here is where the most classic and historically important vulnerability type comes in. It is called a buffer overflow. A buffer is a fixed-size region of memory allocated to hold data. When a program reads input from a user, or from a file, or from a network, it typically reads that data into a buffer. If the input is larger than the buffer can hold, and the program does not check the size before writing, the extra data overflows past the end of the buffer and overwrites whatever is in memory next to the buffer. On the stack, a buffer for user input might be sitting right next to the return address saved by the last function call. If an attacker sends input carefully crafted to be exactly the right size to overflow the buffer and overwrite the return address with a new value, then when the function returns, the processor reads the attacker's return address instead of the original one and jumps to wherever the attacker wants. The attacker has redirected the execution flow. They have taken control of the program. This attack was the central technique in the Morris worm of 1988. It has been exploited in thousands of different software vulnerabilities since then. And despite decades of improvements in programming languages, compiler protections, and operating system defenses, buffer overflows still appear in software today. They appear in browsers. They appear in operating systems. They appear in industrial control systems. They appear in embedded devices like routers and security cameras. Modern operating systems have implemented several defenses against buffer overflow attacks. One is called Address Space Layout Randomization, abbreviated ASLR. ASLR randomizes the memory addresses at which programs and libraries are loaded each time they run. If the attacker does not know where in memory their shellcode will end up, they cannot write a correct return address to jump to it. Another defense is called the no-execute bit, or NX bit. Modern processors can mark regions of memory as non-executable. The stack, which contains data, can be marked as non-executable. If the processor tries to execute code from a region marked non-executable, it refuses and generates an error. This prevents the simplest form of buffer overflow attack, where the attacker places their malicious code directly in the overflowed buffer. But attackers have found ways around both of these defenses. Against ASLR, attackers developed information leak techniques. A secondary vulnerability in the same program might reveal the actual addresses being used in the current execution, allowing the attacker to calculate where their code is. Against the NX bit, attackers developed a technique called return-oriented programming, or ROP. Instead of injecting new code, ROP chains together small fragments of existing code already present in the program or in the operating system libraries it uses. These fragments, called gadgets, are short sequences of instructions that end with a return instruction. By carefully constructing a series of return addresses on the stack, the attacker can chain these gadgets together in sequence, executing a complex series of operations using only code that was already legitimately present in the system. ROP is extraordinarily clever. The attacker uses the program's own code against it. There is no injected code for the NX protection to block. The code being executed is code the system trusts. Only its sequence and context have been changed. Let us now look at a different class of vulnerability: format string vulnerabilities. Many programming languages, including the C language, in which a significant portion of operating system code is written, include functions for formatting output. The most famous is called printf. Printf takes a format string as input, which contains special symbols that tell it where to insert values. For example, the symbol %d tells printf to insert a decimal integer at that position. The symbol %s tells it to insert a string of characters. A format string vulnerability occurs when user-supplied input is passed directly as the format string to a function like printf. An attacker can supply a format string containing % symbols that cause the function to read values from unexpected places in memory, or to write values to arbitrary memory locations. Format string vulnerabilities were extremely common in software written before this class of bug was well understood. They allowed attackers to read sensitive data from memory, such as passwords or encryption keys, or to overwrite memory at specific addresses, including function pointers and return addresses. Integer overflow vulnerabilities are another important class. Computer programs represent numbers using a fixed number of bits. A 32-bit unsigned integer, for example, can hold values from 0 to 4,294,967,295. If arithmetic operations cause the value to exceed this maximum, the value wraps around back to 0. This can cause programs to allocate buffers that are too small, to skip security checks that rely on comparisons with the overflowed value, or to access memory outside intended bounds. Use after free vulnerabilities occur when a program uses a reference to a region of memory after that memory has been freed and returned to the system. The freed memory may have been reallocated for another purpose. If the attacker can control what data is placed in the reallocated memory, they can influence what the program does when it uses that memory again through the old reference. Use after free vulnerabilities have been heavily exploited in web browsers, which are extremely complex programs that handle enormous amounts of untrusted content from the internet. Heap spray is an exploitation technique often used in combination with vulnerabilities like use after free. The heap is the region of memory where programs store dynamically allocated data, as opposed to the stack which handles function calls. In a heap spray attack, the attacker fills large areas of the heap with copies of their shell code, the malicious code they want to execute. Then they trigger the vulnerability. Because so much of the heap is now covered in shell code, the probability that the vulnerability redirects execution into a region containing shell code is very high. Heap sprays are particularly common in browser exploits delivered through web pages. Now, let us discuss how these vulnerabilities are delivered to victim systems. The delivery mechanism is the bridge between the attacker and the target. The most straightforward delivery mechanism is direct network exploitation. If a vulnerable network service is exposed to the Internet, an attacker can send carefully crafted network traffic to that service that exploits the vulnerability, causing the server to execute the attacker's code. No user interaction is required. The server is running. The attacker sends packets. The server becomes infected. This was the mechanism used by the SQL slammer worm of 2003. SQL Slammer targeted a vulnerability in Microsoft SQL Server, a database software product. The worm was extraordinarily compact. Its entire code was contained in a single UDP packet, which is a type of network packet used for fast, connectionless communication. The packet exploited a buffer overflow vulnerability in SQL Server. When the server received the packet, the vulnerability allowed the packet's code to execute. The code immediately began scanning for other SQL Server installations and sending them the same packet. SQL Slammer infected approximately 75,000 servers in the first 10 minutes after its release. Within 3 days, it had infected 300,000 servers. It caused widespread internet congestion and outages, including disruptions to ATM networks, airline ticketing systems, and emergency services in some regions. 3 days of global internet disruption. 1 UDP packet. Drive-by download attacks represent a more indirect delivery mechanism. The attacker does not target servers. They target users who visit web pages. The attacker compromises a web server or sets up a malicious website and embeds exploit code in the web page. When a user visits the page with a vulnerable browser, the exploit code runs and installs malware without the user clicking on anything, without the user downloading anything, without the user doing anything except loading a web page. Hence the name drive-by. The user simply drives by and gets infected. Spear phishing is a highly targeted version of email-based delivery. Unlike bulk phishing campaigns that send the same deceptive email to millions of people, spear phishing involves careful research of the specific target. The attacker learns about the target's organization, colleagues, projects, and communication style. They craft an email that appears to come from a trusted colleague or business partner, referring to specific real projects or events, asking the target to open an attached document or click a link. The level of personalization makes the deception extremely convincing. Stuxnet was delivered to its ultimate target, an air-gapped nuclear facility in Iran, through a spear phishing campaign that infected laptops belonging to contractors who worked at the facility. USB-based infection is another delivery mechanism that deserves attention. An air-gapped computer is a computer that is physically isolated from the Internet and from all external networks. This is done for systems that must be highly secure, such as the control systems for nuclear facilities, military command networks, and financial clearing systems. An air-gapped network cannot be reached over the Internet. It can only be infected if malicious code is physically introduced into the environment. The most common vector for this is a USB drive. An infected USB drive inserted into an air-gapped computer by an employee, a contractor, or an unsuspecting visitor can carry malware across the air gap. The Stuxnet worm was carried into Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility by infected USB drives. Nobody knows exactly who carried them in. They may have been planted on contractors who regularly worked at the facility. They may have been left in parking lots or mailed to employees with the knowledge that someone eventually would plug one into a computer. The technique of leaving infected USB drives in places where target personnel will find and use them has been named USB drop attacks by security researchers, and experimental studies have found that people plug in found USB drives with alarming frequency. Now we understand the delivery mechanisms. We understand the vulnerabilities they exploit. But once the virus code is executing on the target system, what happens next? How does it establish persistence? How does it spread within the network? How does it hide from detection? These are the questions for the next chapter. Chapter 5: Persistence, Propagation and Evasion. Getting onto a system is only the first step. For a virus to be truly effective, it needs to do 3 more things. It needs to survive, it needs to spread, and it needs to stay hidden. Persistence is the ability to survive reboots and remain active on the infected system over time. A virus that runs once and disappears when the computer is restarted is a very limited threat. A virus that re-establishes itself every time the computer starts, reliably and invisibly, is a far more serious problem. Modern operating systems have multiple mechanisms for running code automatically when the system starts. On Windows systems, the most commonly exploited persistence mechanisms include the Windows registry, startup folders, scheduled tasks, and Windows services. The Windows registry is a hierarchical database that stores configuration settings for the operating system and installed applications. Within the registry, there are specific keys whose values are automatically run when a user logs in. The most well-known of these is in the path HKE current user /software /Microsoft /Windows /current version /run. Any program path placed as a value under this registry key will be executed automatically when the current user logs in. A virus that writes its own executable path to this location will run every time the user logs in. And because the registry is not typically displayed to the user or easily browsed, the virus's presence there often goes unnoticed for months or years. Scheduled tasks are another persistence mechanism. Both Windows and Linux include facilities for scheduling programs to run at specific times or intervals. On Windows, the Task Scheduler service manages this. A virus can create a scheduled task that runs itself every few minutes, every hour, or at system startup. Scheduled tasks can be created with legitimate system administration tools, making malicious tasks blend in among legitimate ones. Windows services are background processes that run independently of user sessions. They start with the operating system, run continuously, and can be configured to restart automatically if they crash. Installing malware as a Windows service gives it all the persistence of a legitimate system service. It runs even before a user logs in. It continues running after the user logs out. And because legitimate services are expected to run in the background, users rarely notice a malicious one among the dozens of legitimate services running on a typical Windows installation. On Linux systems, which power the vast majority of web servers and many other critical infrastructure systems, equivalent persistence mechanisms include cron jobs, system services, and init scripts. Cron is a time-based job scheduler. It reads configuration files to determine what programs to run and when. A malicious cron job added to the system's cron configuration will execute on schedule regardless of who is logged in. Rootkits represent the most extreme form of persistence and evasion combined. A rootkit is a set of techniques, often including software, for hiding the presence of malware on a system. The name comes from the Unix concept of root access, which is the equivalent of administrator privileges, and kit, meaning a collection of tools. A rootkit modifies the operating system itself to hide evidence of infection. Kernel mode rootkits, also called Ring 0 rootkits, operate at the deepest level of the operating system. They intercept the system calls that the operating system kernel uses to perform operations like listing files, listing running processes, and reporting network connections. When security software asks the kernel to list all running processes, the rootkit intercepts the answer and removes its own processes from the list before returning it. When the kernel is asked to list the files in a directory, the rootkit removes the entries for its own files. When the kernel is asked about network connections, the rootkit hides its own connections. From the perspective of any software running above the kernel level, including antivirus software, system monitoring tools, and the user, the infected system appears completely clean. Nothing is out of place. The files exist but are hidden. The processes are running but are invisible. The network connections are active but are not shown. The rootkit has rewritten reality, at least the reality visible to software. Detecting a kernel mode rootkit from within the infected system is extraordinarily difficult. One approach is to boot the system from a clean external drive and scan the system from outside, where the rootkit's interception is not running. Another is to compare data that comes from different sources. If the number of processes reported by the kernel differs from the number that can be detected by monitoring the CPU scheduler directly, something is hiding processes. Specialized rootkit detection tools use techniques like cross-view detection, comparing what the kernel reports with what can be observed through lower-level interfaces. Let us now look at propagation, specifically how a virus spreads within a network after infecting an initial machine. Once a virus has established itself on a computer inside an organization's network, it has a significant advantage. Most organizational networks are designed with their primary security perimeter on the outside. The firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and filtered internet connections are all focused on traffic coming from outside the organization. Traffic between computers on the internal network is often trusted by default. Security researchers call this the castle and moat problem. The defenses focus on keeping outsiders out, but once an attacker is inside, they can often move relatively freely. Network scanning is the first step in internal propagation. The virus explores the local network by sending probes to other machines and checking what services are running. It identifies machines running Windows file sharing, database servers, web servers, remote management interfaces, and other potentially vulnerable services. It then attempts to exploit vulnerabilities in those services, applying the same techniques we described in the previous chapter, to spread to additional machines. Credential harvesting is another critical propagation technique. Modern Windows networks use a system called Active Directory to manage users, computers, and permissions across an organization. Users log in with usernames and passwords that are verified against the Active Directory server. When a user logs into a Windows computer, their authentication credentials are handled by a part of the operating system called the Local Security Authority, and cached versions of those credentials are stored in memory. There is a tool called Mimikatz, first released publicly in 2011, that can extract these cached credential hashes from memory. The credential hash is a cryptographic transformation of the password. Depending on how it is stored, the hash might be directly usable for authentication without knowing the actual password, a technique called pass the hash. Or it might be crackable offline using dictionary attacks and brute force. Once a virus has extracted credentials from one compromised machine, it can use those credentials to log into other machines on the network that the same user has access to. If the compromised credentials belong to a domain administrator, an account with administrative access to all machines in the domain, the virus can spread to every single machine in the organization in a very short time. This is exactly what happened in the NotPetya attack of 2017, which we will examine in a later chapter. NotPetya spread so quickly through organizations that entire corporate networks were encrypted in under an hour. Now let us examine evasion in depth. Evasion is the techniques viruses use to avoid detection by security software. It is an arms race in the most literal sense. Antivirus software gets better at detecting viruses. Virus authors respond with new evasion techniques. Security researchers develop methods to defeat those evasion techniques. Virus authors develop new ones, and so on without end. The original approach to detecting viruses was signature-based detection. A signature is a sequence of bytes that is uniquely characteristic of a specific virus. Antivirus software maintains a database of these signatures. When it scans a file, it looks for matches with any signature in its database. If it finds a match, it flags the file as infected. Signature-based detection is fast and accurate for known viruses, but it has a fundamental weakness. It can only detect viruses that are already in the signature database. A new virus, one that has never been seen before, has no signature in the database and will not be detected. This is the zero-day problem again. The attacker only needs to be new. The defender needs to know about every single possible threat. Polymorphic viruses were the first major counter to signature-based detection. The word polymorphic comes from the Greek for many forms. A polymorphic virus changes its code with every infection while preserving its functional behavior. The virus includes an encryption module and a decryption module. The functional virus code is encrypted. The decryption module, which is different with every infection, decrypts the virus code in memory before executing it. Because the encrypted virus code looks different with every infection, there is no stable signature to detect. The decryption routine is different every time as well, using different encryption keys and sometimes different encryption algorithms. To counter polymorphic viruses, antivirus software began using emulation. The antivirus software runs the suspicious file inside a safe virtual environment, a miniature simulated computer, and watches what it does. The decryption routine will eventually decrypt the virus body, and the antivirus can then examine the decrypted code. But emulation is computationally expensive and takes time. And if the antivirus does not emulate long enough, the virus may not have decrypted itself before the emulation stops. Metamorphic viruses go further than polymorphic viruses. A metamorphic virus rewrites its entire code with every infection. It uses what is called a mutation engine, which is code that takes the virus code and generates a functionally equivalent but structurally different version. The mutation engine might replace one sequence of instructions with a different sequence that produces the same result. It might reorder blocks of code that are independent of each other. It might insert junk instructions that do nothing but change the apparent code structure. It might rename all the internal variables. The result is a virus that looks completely different at the binary level with every infection, but does exactly the same thing. Detecting metamorphic viruses requires behavioral analysis rather than signature matching. The question is not what the code looks like, but what the code does. This is a much harder problem. A sequence of instructions that encrypts files looks different from ransomware at the signature level if the ransomware is metamorphic. But its behavior, specifically accessing and encrypting large numbers of files in rapid succession, is still characteristic and detectable. Fileless malware represents a more recent and more sophisticated evasion approach. Traditional malware exists as files on the disk. Antivirus software scans files. But what if the malware never writes a file to disk at all? Fileless malware exists entirely in memory. It exploits a vulnerability in a legitimate program, such as a web browser or a document reader, and then executes its malicious code entirely within that process's memory space. The malicious code may download additional code from the internet and execute it directly in memory. It may use legitimate operating system utilities like PowerShell, which is a built-in scripting environment in Windows, to execute its operations. Nothing is written to disk. When the computer is restarted, all memory is cleared and the malware appears to be gone. But the malware has already used legitimate persistence mechanisms to ensure it will be re-downloaded and re-executed the next time the system starts. Fileless malware is significantly harder to detect than traditional file-based malware. There are no files to scan. The malicious activity appears to come from legitimate programs like PowerShell. Security software must analyze the behavior of these legitimate programs to distinguish malicious use from legitimate use. This is technically challenging and produces false positives, legitimate administrative activities that look suspicious, which creates alert fatigue in security teams. Living off the land is the term security researchers use for malware that relies primarily on tools and capabilities that are already present on the target system. PowerShell, Windows Management Instrumentation, the Task Scheduler, the Windows Script Host, network administration tools like PSExec, all of these are built into Windows for legitimate purposes. A skilled attacker can accomplish nearly everything they need using only these built-in tools. Because the tools are legitimate, their use is less suspicious. Because they are present on every Windows system, the attacker does not need to bring their own tools, reducing the chance of their custom code being detected. Chapter 6. The I Love You Catastrophe and the Age of Mass Infection. In the year 2000, two programmers named Leonel Ramones and Onel de Guzman, working from the Philippines, changed the world. They did not intend to. Or perhaps de Guzman did, but not on the scale it happened. Their creation, the I Love You virus, became the fastest spreading piece of malicious software the world had ever seen. The virus was technically a worm written in VB script, which is a scripting language built into Windows. But it was delivered as an email attachment and called a virus by virtually everyone. So virus is what history calls it. The email carrying it appeared in inboxes around the world on the 4th of May 2000. The subject line was, "I love you," in capital letters. The attachment was labeled Love Letter for You, txt.vbs. Windows hid the .vbs extension by default, so users saw only Love Letter for You, txt. It looked like a plain text file. It looked like a love letter. Who can resist a love letter? Apparently, very few people. Within a day, I Love You had infected an estimated 45 million computers across the world. Large organizations reported their email servers collapsing under the load. The Pentagon shut down its email servers. The British Parliament shut down its email. News organizations, banks, hospitals, government agencies all reported infections. In total, the virus caused an estimated $10 billion in damage from lost data, system downtime, and cleanup costs. Let us walk through exactly what happened when someone opened that attachment. The VB script code began executing through the Windows Script Host, a built-in interpreter for scripting languages. The first thing the script did was copy itself to multiple locations on the hard drive, using several different file names, ensuring redundancy. It then made modifications to the Windows registry to ensure it would run automatically at every system startup, establishing persistence. Next, The script searched the infected computer's file system for files with specific extensions, including JPG and JPEG for images, MP3 for audio files, VBs for other VBS script files, and several others. When it found files with these extensions, it either deleted them or replaced them with copies of itself, renamed to match the original file name, but with the .vbs extension added. The user's photos, music, and other files were gone, replaced by copies of the virus. The propagation mechanism was the most devastating aspect. The script accessed the victim's Microsoft Outlook email client and retrieved every email address in every contact folder and address book. It then sent an email with the "I love you" subject line and an infected attachment to every one of those addresses. This was done automatically in the background while the user was sitting at their computer. The user's own identity, their own email account, their own trusted contact list was weaponized against everyone they knew. Email infrastructure in the year 2000 was not designed to handle this kind of load. Email servers were overwhelmed with millions of copies of the virus being sent simultaneously. Server queues filled and backed up. The load was so severe that many organizations found their email service completely paralyzed, unable to send or receive any messages at all. From a purely technical perspective, I Love You was not exceptionally sophisticated. The techniques it used were individually well known. What made it devastating was the combination of factors. The social engineering was perfect. A love letter is one of the most emotionally irresistible messages one human being can receive from another. The exploitation of Windows's hidden file extensions was clever. The use of the victim's own contact list for propagation was brutally efficient. And the timing in May 2000, when internet use was expanding rapidly and email had become a primary communication tool in businesses worldwide, meant the conditions for maximum spread were present. The investigation into I Love You led to the Philippines. De Guzman was identified as a suspect. He was a student at a Philippine college who had earlier proposed, in a rejected thesis, a program that could steal internet passwords by sending them to the program's creator. The thesis was rejected on ethical grounds. He appears to have implemented a version of it anyway. However, when the case was investigated, Filipino prosecutors found that there was no law in the Philippines at the time that made writing and releasing a computer virus a crime. De Guzman was never charged. The Philippines subsequently passed computer crime legislation. But the damage was done, and the perpetrator walked free. I Love You changed the landscape of computer security permanently. It demonstrated that viruses did not need to be technically sophisticated to be catastrophic. They needed to understand human psychology. The human being sitting at the keyboard was, and remains, the most exploitable vulnerability in any computer system. The years that followed brought a wave of destructive malware. In 2001, the code red worm exploited a buffer overflow vulnerability in Microsoft's Internet Information Services web server software. Within 14 hours of its initial release, Code Red had infected an estimated 300,000 servers. The worm had a specific payload, On specific dates of each month, infected servers would launch coordinated denial-of-service attacks against the White House website. The White House was forced to change its server's IP address to avoid the attack. Code red caused an estimated $2 billion in damage. Also, in 2001, the NIMDA worm appeared. NIMDA, which is admin spelled backwards, was notable for using 5 different propagation mechanisms simultaneously. It spread via email attachments. It spread via web pages, infecting vulnerable browsers that visited infected sites. It spread via network shares, copying itself to shared folders it could access. It exploited the same vulnerability as Code Red in IIS web servers. And it modified web content on infected servers to contain exploit code, so that visitors to those sites would also be infected. The multi-vector approach made NIMDA spread extremely rapidly and made cleanup far more complicated, since all 5 infection vectors had to be addressed simultaneously. The SQL Slammer worm of January 2003 was the fastest spreading computer worm in history at the time. As described earlier, it targeted a buffer overflow vulnerability in Microsoft SQL Server. The worm was contained in a single UDP packet of 376 bytes. When a vulnerable SQL server received this packet, it executed the worm's code. The code immediately began generating random IP addresses and sending copies of the packet to those addresses at maximum speed. An infected SQL server could send out 25,000 packets per second. Within 10 minutes of its release, SQL Slammer had infected 75,000 servers. Within 30 minutes, there were so many infected servers generating so much traffic that significant portions of the internet began slowing down due to congestion. South Korea's internet access was effectively cut off. Finland lost connectivity. ATM networks in the United States failed. Airline check-in systems went offline. Emergency services dispatching systems in some regions stopped working. The worm did not have a destructive payload. The damage came entirely from the network traffic it generated. Every infected server was operating as a traffic generator at maximum speed, not because it intended harm, but because that was the most efficient way to find and infect other servers. The internet itself became the victim, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of scanning traffic. This event taught a critical lesson. A worm does not need a destructive payload to cause catastrophic damage. The act of uncontrolled replication can itself be the weapon. A worm designed specifically to generate maximum network traffic with no payload at all could potentially take down major internet infrastructure. By 2003 and 2004, organized crime had noticed the potential of malicious software. The era of the hobbyist virus writer, motivated by fame, curiosity, or the desire to demonstrate technical prowess, was not over, but it was being joined by something far more dangerous. Professional criminal organizations motivated by money. The Sobig worm family and the My Doom worm of 2004 both showed signs of professional organization. They were designed not just to spread, but to build infrastructure. Infected computers became nodes in botnets, networks of compromised machines that could be controlled remotely. These botnets were rented to other criminals for spam campaigns and denial of service attacks. The economic model of malware was shifting from disruption to profit. This shift toward financially motivated malware would define the next 2 decades. But before we explore that world, we need to examine something even more significant. The moment when computer viruses went from being criminal tools to being state weapons. The moment when code became the equivalent of a military strike. The moment when a computer virus physically destroyed nuclear centrifuges. Chapter 7. Stuxnet. When code became a weapon of war. In January 2010, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency arrived at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility in Iran for a routine inspection. The IAEA had been monitoring Iran's nuclear program closely and regularly inspecting the facility. What they found puzzled them. The centrifuges were failing at an unprecedented rate. Centrifuges break down. It is expected. At a facility the size of Natanz, with thousands of centrifuges running continuously, about 800 centrifuge failures per year would be normal. But the rate the IAEA was seeing was far higher, and neither the Iranians nor the IAEA inspectors could understand why. In Belarus, several months later, a small computer security company called Virus Blockader was investigating complaints from an Iranian client about computers that were repeatedly crashing. The company's analyst, Sergei Ulasin, found something in the crash logs that did not fit any known malware. He found files he had never seen before. He found Windows drivers signed with legitimate certificates from well-known companies, Realtek and J-Micron, 2 major hardware manufacturers. Signed drivers are supposed to be trustworthy. These were not. The certificates had been stolen. What Ulasin had found was Stuxnet, and Stuxnet was not a virus. It was not a worm in the conventional sense. It was a weapon, the most sophisticated piece of malicious code ever discovered at that point in history, and possibly ever. Let us examine Stuxnet's technical architecture in detail, because understanding how it worked is understanding what is possible when the resources of a nation-state are devoted to developing cyber weapons. Stuxnet was approximately 500 kilobytes in size. For comparison, a typical modern smartphone photograph is 3,000 to 5,000 kilobytes. In those 500 kilobytes lived a staggering amount of sophistication. The worm was written in multiple programming languages. This was unusual and suggested multiple development teams working on different components. Its complexity was far beyond what criminal malware organizations were known to be capable of. Kaspersky Lab, one of the world's leading computer security firms, concluded that only a nation-state could have created it. The consensus among security researchers and government officials, though never officially confirmed by any government, is that Stuxnet was developed jointly by the United States and Israel as part of a classified program called Operation Olympic Games, initiated under President George W. Bush and continued under President Obama. Stuxnet exploited 4 zero-day vulnerabilities in Windows. Using 4 zero-day vulnerabilities in a single piece of malware was, in 2010, absolutely unprecedented. Zero-day vulnerabilities are precious. They can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars each on the open market. Using 4 of them in a single attack was an extraordinary expenditure of intelligence resources, implying a target so important that no expense was considered too great. The first zero-day involved Windows shortcut files, which are files with the .lnk extension. Windows Explorer, the file browser, automatically executes certain code when it displays an icon for a shortcut file. Stuxnet exploited a vulnerability in this process. Simply having the infected USB drive connected and opening a folder containing the shortcut file was enough to trigger execution. The user did not need to double-click anything. They did not need to open the shortcut file. They only needed to navigate to a folder in Windows Explorer, causing Explorer to display the shortcuts icon, and Stuxnet would execute. Think carefully about what that means. The user did nothing wrong. They made no mistake. They were simply browsing their files in the normal way, and the virus executed anyway. The second zero-day was in the Windows Print Spooler service, which manages printing on Windows systems. Stuxnet exploited this vulnerability to spread over local networks, copying itself to other machines via the network share that the print spooler uses. The third and fourth zero-days involved Windows Task Scheduler and a kernel vulnerability that allowed Stuxnet to escalate its privileges to kernel level once inside a system. Stuxnet also exploited 2 previously known but unpatched vulnerabilities, the MS-08 and 067 vulnerability used by the Configure worm, and a vulnerability in SQL Server. Using both known and unknown vulnerabilities simultaneously made the worm adaptable. If a particular machine had been patched against one vulnerability, another might still work. Now, the most technically brilliant and disturbing aspect of Stuxnet: its payload. Stuxnet was not looking for data to steal. It was not looking to extort anyone. It was not building a botnet. It was looking for something very specific: Siemens Step 7 software. Siemens Step 7 is a Windows-based software package used to program Siemens programmable logic controllers, which are abbreviated as PLCs. A programmable logic controller is a specialized computer designed to control industrial equipment. PLCs run the motors, valves, pumps, and other mechanical systems in factories, power plants, water treatment facilities, and other industrial installations. They receive sensor readings and send commands to actuators. They are the bridge between the computer world and the physical world. Iran's Natanz facility used Siemens PLCs to control the centrifuges that enriched uranium. Uranium enrichment works by feeding uranium hexafluoride gas into centrifuges spinning at extremely high speed. The centrifuges spin at somewhere between 43,000 and 63,000 revolutions per minute. The slightly heavier uranium-238 hexafluoride molecules are pushed to the outside of the centrifuge by centrifugal force, while the slightly lighter uranium-235 hexafluoride molecules concentrate toward the center. By connecting many centrifuges in series in an arrangement called a cascade, The concentration of uranium-235 can be increased from the natural level of approximately 0.7% to the levels needed for nuclear fuel or nuclear weapons. The centrifuges used at Natanz were designed to spin within very specific frequency ranges to function correctly. The frequency of rotation is controlled by frequency converter drives, which are electronic devices that control the speed of motors. Iran was using frequency converter drives manufactured by two specific companies. Stuxnet was programmed to look specifically for these drives. If Stuxnet found itself on a computer connected to the right PLCs, driving the right frequency converters, operating in the right frequency ranges, indicating a uranium enrichment cascade, it activated its payload. If it did not find these specific conditions, it sat dormant. It spread. It infected new machines. But it did nothing destructive. It was looking for one thing and only one thing. Once it found the target, Stuxnet executed one of the most ingenious attacks in the history of engineering. It reprogrammed the PLCs to periodically change the frequency of the centrifuge drives in a specific pattern. It would cause the drives to overspeed the centrifuges to around 1410 Hz for a period, then drop them to around 2 Hz, then return them to normal operating frequency. The normal operating frequency was around 1064 Hz. These extreme variations in speed, well outside the centrifuge's designed operating range, put enormous physical stress on the machines. The centrifuges were being repeatedly pushed past their limits, then abruptly slowed almost to a stop, then brought back. At the same time, Stuxnet reprogrammed the PLCs to record 20 seconds of normal operation data. Then it looped that recording, playing it back to the control computers as the real-time sensor data. The control computers, which the Iranian engineers monitored, showed completely normal operation. The sensors showed normal temperatures, normal pressures, normal speeds. Everything looked fine. But the centrifuges were actually being systematically damaged. This is an astonishing piece of engineering. The attack happened across 4 distinct layers simultaneously. The Windows operating system layer, where the worm spread and established itself. The Siemens Step 7 software layer, where the worm modified the PLC programming. The PLC layer, where the actual control commands to the centrifuges were changed. And the sensor data layer, where normal data was recorded and replayed to deceive the monitoring systems. Iranian engineers began to notice centrifuges failing. They replaced them. More centrifuges failed. They could not determine the cause. Everything their instruments showed them said the system was operating normally. The damage appeared random. Equipment malfunction, they assumed. Supply chain issues, perhaps with the Siemens components Iran had been forced to obtain through embargo-busting procurement channels. It was not until Stuxnet was discovered and its full functionality was reverse-engineered by security researchers that the picture became clear. Estimates suggest that Stuxnet destroyed approximately 1,000 to 2,000 of Iran's centrifuges, 1/5 of the total installed at Natanz. The IAEA confirmed an unusually high rate of centrifuge replacement during the period Stuxnet was active. Satellite imagery showed centrifuges being removed from the facility. One analyst estimated that Stuxnet set Iran's nuclear program back by at least 2 years. The implications of Stuxnet extended far beyond Iran's nuclear program. Stuxnet proved several things that had previously been theoretical. It proved that a cyber weapon could cause physical destruction. It proved that an air-gapped network could be penetrated. It proved that the level of sophistication achievable with sufficient resources could defeat multiple layers of security simultaneously. And it proved that industrial control systems, systems controlling power plants, water facilities, transportation networks, chemical plants, anything connected to PLCs, were vulnerable to targeted attack. Security researcher Ralph Langner, who was among the first to fully analyze Stuxnet, described it as a military-grade cyber weapon. He was exactly right, but a military-grade cyber weapon that was now public. Its code was available. Its techniques were documented. Other nation-states and sophisticated criminal organizations could study it, learn from it, and build their own versions. In the years after Stuxnet, related pieces of malware were discovered. Flame, a cyber espionage tool of extraordinary complexity, appeared to share some code modules with Stuxnet. Duke, another sophisticated spying tool, was believed to come from the same development shop. The consensus among security researchers was that these were products of the same nation-state program, different tools designed for different missions. Together, they represented the emergence of state-sponsored cyber warfare as a real, active, ongoing activity. Stuxnet's legacy is uncomfortable. It worked. As a military operation, it delayed Iran's nuclear program. It avoided a kinetic military strike that could have destabilized the entire Middle East. But it also opened Pandora's box. By demonstrating what was possible, it implicitly gave permission to every other nation-state with the resources to develop similar weapons to do so. And unlike a physical weapon, cyber weapons are not stored in a secure facility. Once their techniques are public, they exist everywhere. Chapter 8. The Rise of Ransomware and Criminal Ecosystems. By 2012, the architecture of the cybercrime economy had taken a form that would persist and expand for the following decade. It was organized. It was professional. It operated with a degree of corporate structure that, if applied to legitimate business, would have generated considerable admiration. The central product of this economy was ransomware. But before we examine ransomware as a phenomenon, let us understand the criminal ecosystem that supports it, because the virus is only one piece of a much larger infrastructure. The first component is the malware itself. Writing sophisticated ransomware requires skill, time, and resources. Early ransomware was written by individual programmers or small teams, but by the mid-2010s, a business model called Ransomware as a Service, or RAAS, had emerged. Criminal organizations wrote and maintained the malware, the encryption system, the payment infrastructure, and the command and control servers. They then rented this infrastructure to affiliate groups who handled the actual attacks. The core developers typically received 20 to 30% of ransom payments. The affiliates who found targets and deployed the ransomware kept the rest. This business model separated the technical requirements from the operational requirements. An affiliate did not need to know how to write ransomware. They needed to know how to gain initial access to target networks and deploy the ransomware payload. The core developers did not need to find victims. They provided the tools. Division of labor applied to cybercrime. The initial access component of this economy generated its own marketplace. Initial access brokers are specialists who compromise networks and then sell that access to other criminals. They might exploit a public-facing vulnerability in a company's VPN appliance, which is the software that provides secure remote access to a network. They might conduct phishing campaigns and capture credentials. They might purchase stolen credentials from information-stealing malware. Then they sell the access they have gained, sometimes for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size and value of the target organization. Ransomware operators buy this access and deploy their payload. The payment infrastructure had its own sophistication. Ransomware demands payment in cryptocurrency, specifically in currencies like Bitcoin and Monero. Cryptocurrency payments are pseudonymous. A wallet address reveals nothing about who controls it. Transactions are recorded on a public blockchain, but the identity behind each wallet is not disclosed. Criminals use techniques called mixing and tumbling, passing cryptocurrency through chains of wallets and exchanges to obscure the trail. Though law enforcement has developed increasingly sophisticated tools for tracing these transactions. The targets of ransomware attacks evolved significantly over time. Early ransomware targeted individual users. It would encrypt personal files on a home computer and demand payments of a few $100s. The economics were straightforward but limited. 1 million infected home users might yield $100 million if 1% paid. But processing that many small payments and supporting 1 million victims requires enormous operational overhead. The shift toward enterprise targets, what security researchers call big game hunting, changed the economics dramatically. Rather than infecting millions of home users, sophisticated ransomware groups began targeting large organizations. A single successful attack on a large hospital, a major corporation, or a government agency could yield ransom demands in the millions or tens of millions of dollars. The attack required more sophistication and more effort, but the payoff made it worthwhile. The WannaCry ransomware attack of May 2017 was a global catastrophe. WannaCry used an exploitation tool called Eternal Blue, which had been developed by the United States National Security Agency to exploit a vulnerability in Windows implementation of the Server Message Block Protocol, which is the protocol Windows uses for file sharing. Eternal Blue had been stolen from the NSA and leaked publicly by a group calling itself Shadow Brokers. The WannaCry ransomware incorporated Eternal Blue to spread automatically through networks, worm-style, infecting any vulnerable Windows machine it could reach. The spread was catastrophic. WannaCry infected more than 230,000 computers in over 150 countries within a single day. The United Kingdom's National Health Service was severely hit. Hospitals across England and Scotland could not access patient records. Doctors reverted to pen and paper. Non-emergency appointments were cancelled, surgeries were delayed, ambulances were diverted. Estimates suggest the NHS attack alone cost the health service approximately 100 million British pounds. Globally, WannaCry caused an estimated $4 billion to $8 billion in damage. WannaCry had a significant technical flaw. A security researcher named Marcus Hutchins, analyzing the malware's code, noticed that it made a request to a specific domain name before executing its payload. The domain was long and nonsensical, clearly not a real website. Hutchins registered the domain for about $10. When infected computers made the request and received a valid response from the now registered domain, WannaCry's kill switch activated and it stopped spreading. Hutchins inadvertently stopped the attack by registering a domain name. He became an accidental hero, but the scale of damage in the hours before this discovery was already enormous. The following month, NotPetya appeared. NotPetya was even more destructive. It also used Eternal Blue. It was initially distributed through a compromised update mechanism for a Ukrainian accounting software package called MEDoc, which was used by a large proportion of Ukrainian businesses. NotPetya spread through the accounting software's update channel, meaning organizations received it as a seemingly legitimate software update. NotPetya combined Eternal Blue for network propagation with credential harvesting using a variant of Mimikatz and passed the hash attacks. The combination was devastating. It entered a network through one machine, harvested credentials, and used those credentials to spread laterally across the entire network with extraordinary speed. The Maersk Shipping Company, one of the world's largest shipping firms, had its entire global network encrypted within minutes. 49,000 computers, 1,000 servers, all encrypted. The company lost the ability to process shipping orders for days. Every port terminal in the company's global network was affected. Estimated damage to Maersk alone was between 200 and 300 million US. In total, NotPetya caused approximately $10 billion in damage worldwide, making it the most financially destructive cyber attack in history to that point. NotPetya was technically ransomware, displaying ransom demands. But security researchers concluded that it was not actually intended to generate ransom payments. The decryption mechanism was non-functional, meaning victims could not recover their files, even if they paid. NotPetya was designed to destroy. The ransom demand was a cover. The United States, United Kingdom, and European Union governments attributed NotPetya to the Russian military intelligence agency, GRU, specifically its Sandworm team, intended as a destructive attack on Ukrainian infrastructure that spiraled out of control and caused massive collateral damage worldwide. This points to something disturbing about cyber weapons in general. Unlike a missile or a bomb, whose blast radius is physically limited, a cyber weapon that spreads through network vulnerabilities can spread globally, affecting targets far beyond the intended victims. Stuxnet spread to tens of thousands of machines outside Iran. WannaCry attacked the UK's health system rather than its intended North Korean targets, who were believed to be using older Windows XP systems. NotPetya devastated global shipping, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and numerous businesses that had no connection to Ukraine or Russia. The collateral damage problem in cyber warfare is unsolved. Chapter 9. How antivirus software works and why it is not enough security software has existed almost as long as malware itself. The first antivirus products appeared in the late 1980s, and for decades it has been locked in a technical arms race with the malware it tries to detect. Understanding how antivirus works is understanding why it is necessary, why it is never sufficient, and what more sophisticated security approaches are needed. Modern antivirus and endpoint security products use multiple detection methods simultaneously. Signature-based detection is the oldest and still the most common approach for known threats. A database of signatures is maintained by the security company. When new malware is discovered, researchers analyze it, extract characteristic byte sequences, and add them to the database. The database is distributed to all users of the product through regular updates. When the product scans a file, it compares the file's contents against every signature in the database. If a match is found, the file is flagged. Modern signature databases contain signatures for hundreds of millions of known malware samples. Scanning a large number of files against such an enormous database would be prohibitively slow using naive methods. Security products use efficient data structures, specifically hash tables, and optimize string matching algorithms to make this scanning fast. Multiple file attributes can be checked in parallel. Common file formats are parsed and specific sections examined rather than scanning the entire file byte by byte. As described earlier, signature-based detection is defeated by new malware, polymorphic malware, and metamorphic malware. The response to this limitation was the development of behavioral detection. Behavioral detection monitors what programs actually do rather than what they look like. Security products hook into the operating system, inserting themselves at key points where programs interact with the system. When a program creates a new file, the security product observes the action. When a program reads from the registry, the security product observes the action. When a program opens a network connection, the security product observes the action. When a program calls certain API functions, API standing for Application Programming Interface and referring to the functions the operating system provides to programs, the security product observes that too. The security product builds a model of what legitimate programs typically do. It also maintains knowledge of what malicious programs typically do. It looks for patterns that match malicious behavior. A program that opens a large number of files in rapid succession and modifies each one is exhibiting behavior consistent with ransomware. A program that enumerates all running processes and attempts to inject code into them is exhibiting behavior consistent with many types of malware. A program that opens a network connection and immediately begins sending data without user interaction is behaving suspiciously. The challenge with behavioral detection is distinguishing malicious behavior from legitimate behavior. Many legitimate programs modify large numbers of files. Backup software reads every file on the system. Video transcoding software modifies large media files. Antivirus software itself reads every file on the system during a scan. The behavioral model must be nuanced enough to distinguish these from malware, and this is a genuinely difficult machine learning and pattern recognition problem. Heuristic analysis attempts to identify previously unseen malware by looking for code characteristics that are suspicious, even if they do not match any known signature. For example, code that decrypts itself in memory before executing is a characteristic shared by many types of malware, even if the specific decryption routine is new. Code that includes instructions to disable security software is suspicious. Code that enumerates and accesses credential storage areas in memory is suspicious. Heuristic rules look for these indicators of suspicious intent. Sandboxing takes behavioral detection a step further by actually running suspicious files in an isolated virtual environment and observing their full behavior before allowing them to run on the real system. A sandbox is a contained simulation of a complete computer, isolated from the real operating system. If the suspicious file is malware, it will execute its malicious behavior inside the sandbox, where it can cause no actual damage. The sandbox records all actions the file takes and can use this behavioral profile to determine whether the file is malicious. Modern malware has developed techniques to detect and evade sandboxes. A sandbox typically runs faster than real hardware because it is a simulation. Malware can measure execution time using processor timing instructions and determine if it is running in a sandbox by detecting the speed discrepancy. A sandbox typically has few files, a limited process list, no user activity, and generic hardware identifiers. Malware can check for user activity patterns for specific software it would expect to find on a real computer, for realistic hardware characteristics, for the presence of specific registry keys that are always present on real Windows installations but often missing in sandboxes. If any of these checks suggest the malware is in a sandbox, it simply does nothing. It waits. It exits cleanly. The sandbox sees no malicious behavior and marks the file as clean. The user gets the file. The file executes on the real system, and only then does the malware activate. Cloud-based detection represents a newer approach. Rather than maintaining all intelligence locally on each device, the security product sends information about suspicious files and behaviors to cloud-based analysis systems. These systems have far more computational resources than any individual device. They can run deep analysis, including emulation and behavioral analysis in parallel. They can cross-reference indicators against threat intelligence from millions of protected devices worldwide. If the same suspicious file is being submitted from thousands of devices simultaneously, that is itself a strong indicator of a new malware outbreak. Machine learning has become a critical component of modern endpoint security. Neural networks trained on millions of samples of both malicious and legitimate software can learn to identify malware with high accuracy based on features that humans might not explicitly have defined. Features extracted from files, including byte distributions, entropy measurements, which measure the randomness of data as a proxy for encryption or compression. Control flow graph structure, the relationships between different code sections, and import tables which list the operating system functions a program uses, can all be fed into neural network models that classify files as malicious or benign. However, machine learning models are not infallible. They can be fooled through a technique called adversarial examples. If an attacker understands the features the model uses to classify malware, they can craft malware that has those features modified to look more like legitimate software to the model, while preserving the malicious functionality. This is an area of active research both in offensive and defensive security. The honest conclusion is that no single security product or approach is sufficient. Defense in depth, meaning multiple overlapping layers of security controls, is the only practical approach. This includes keeping operating systems and software updated to eliminate known vulnerabilities. This includes using endpoint security software. This includes network monitoring to detect unusual traffic patterns. This includes restricting user privileges so that even if malware executes, it cannot access system resources it does not need. This includes regular backups stored offline so that ransomware cannot encrypt the only copy of important data. And crucially, this includes education, because the most sophisticated technical defenses cannot fully compensate for a user who opens every email attachment they receive. Chapter 10. Specific Virus Anatomy. Inside the code. Let us make this more concrete. Let us talk about what the actual code of a virus looks like, in language that does not require a programming background to follow. Consider a simple file-infecting virus. We will call it our example virus. This is not a real virus. We are describing the logical structure to illustrate the concepts. The virus begins with its infection routine. When it first executes on a new computer, it needs to find other files it can infect. The infection routine uses operating system functions to list all executable files in the current directory, in the directory where Windows is installed, and in directories that are listed in the system path variable, which is a list of directories that Windows searches when looking for programs to execute. For each executable file it finds, it checks whether the file is already infected. It can check this by looking for a specific marker it places in infected files, perhaps a specific sequence of bytes in a location that is not normally used. If the marker is not found, the file is not yet infected. The virus then proceeds to infect it. The infection itself involves reading the target executable file into memory. Executable files on Windows have a specific structure defined by the portable executable format. The file begins with a header section that contains metadata about the file. This includes the entry point, which is the memory address where execution begins when the file is loaded. The virus modifies this entry point to the virus code instead of the original program's starting point. It then appends itself to the end of the file. When the infected file is next executed, the processor starts at the modified entry point, executes the virus code, which saves the original entry point and uses it to then jump to the original program's code after the virus has done its work. The user sees the program start normally. The virus has run first in the background without any indication to the user. The trigger routine is the next component. Our example virus checks the current date every time it runs. The operating system provides functions to retrieve the current date and time. The virus calls this function and compares the result to a target date encoded in its code. If the current date matches the target date, the virus activates its payload. If not, it simply completes its infection routine and then executes the host program normally. The payload routine, in our example, performs file deletion. The virus calls operating system functions to enumerate files in the user's documents folder. For each file, it calls the function to delete the file. Documents, spreadsheets, images disappear. The user opens their documents folder and finds it empty. This is a simple example. Real modern malware is orders of magnitude more complex. But the logical structure, find targets, infect them, wait for the trigger, execute the payload, is the same. Now let us talk about how a real piece of sophisticated malware manages its command and control communications. Command and control, abbreviated C2 or C&C, is the communication channel between malware on an infected machine and the attacker's servers. Through this channel, the attacker can send commands to the malware, receive data exfiltrated from the victim, update the malware's configuration, and deploy additional payloads. In the early days of malware, command and control was done through Internet Relay Chat, which is a text-based messaging protocol. The malware connected to a specific IRC server and joined a specific channel. The attacker posted commands to the channel. Every bot in the botnet received them and executed. This was simple and effective, but easily disrupted. Shutting down the IRC server or the channel would cut off the attacker's control. Modern C2 infrastructure is far more resilient. Peer-to-peer command and control removes the central server entirely. Infected machines communicate with each other directly, forming a distributed network. Commands propagate through this network from bot to bot. There is no single server to take down. Destroying parts of the network does not eliminate it. The Configure worm of 2008 used a peer-to-peer C2 mechanism that made it extraordinarily difficult to eliminate, and it remains active on a small number of systems to this day, over 15 years after its initial release. Domain generation algorithms are another technique for resilient C2. Both the malware and the attacker's server use the same algorithm to generate a list of domain names based on inputs like the current date. Every day, the algorithm generates a new list of hundreds or thousands of domains. The malware tries each generated domain until it finds one that resolves to an actual server. The attacker registers one of the generated domains each day, ensuring the malware can always find a working domain. To disrupt this, defenders would need to register every domain the algorithm might generate for every possible future date, which is practically impossible. Covert channels represent an even more sophisticated approach to C2 communication. DNS, which stands for Domain Name System, and is the protocol computers use to look up IP addresses from domain names, is allowed through almost every firewall because it is needed for basic Internet functionality. Malware can encode data in DNS queries, sending small amounts of information to the attacker's DNS server with every lookup. The attacker controls the DNS server and can read the encoded data. The attacker can also respond with encoded commands hidden in the DNS responses. This channel is slow but extremely difficult to detect or block because it looks like legitimate DNS traffic. Malware has also been observed using HTTP and HTTPS traffic to cloud services for C2. Communicating through Google Docs, Microsoft OneDrive, Slack, Twitter, and other legitimate services provides excellent cover because these services are used constantly on legitimate networks and their traffic is trusted. The malware posts commands as documents, comments, or messages on these platforms. The infected machine reads them. Defenders see only traffic to well-known, legitimate cloud services, making detection difficult. The calendar walk malware, discovered in late 2024, retrieved its commands by reading specifically crafted Google Calendar events. An infected machine would connect to Google Calendar, a completely normal and trusted action, and find commands embedded in calendar event descriptions. Security software would see only legitimate Google Calendar traffic. Chapter 11. The Human Vulnerability, Social Engineering and Phishing. Every technical defense can, in principle, be bypassed by exploiting the most fundamental vulnerability in any computer system: the person using it. Social engineering is the use of psychological manipulation to get people to take actions they would not normally take. In the context of computer security, this typically means getting someone to run a malicious file, click a malicious link, enter their credentials on a fake website, or grant access to a system to someone who should not have it. It is not a technical attack. It is a human attack, and it is extraordinarily effective. Phishing is the most common form of social engineering. The term comes from phishing, with the spelling altered, suggesting the attacker casting a lure and waiting for victims to bite. A phishing email impersonates a legitimate entity, such as a bank, an email provider, an employer, or a government agency, and asks the recipient to take an action. The action might be clicking a link to a fake version of the bank's website and entering their login credentials. It might be opening an attached document that contains malicious macros. It might be calling a phone number where a social engineer answers and talks the victim into revealing information or installing software. According to industry data, approximately 92% of all malware is delivered via email. This is not primarily a failure of email security systems, though those can be bypassed. It is a reflection of the power of social engineering. A carefully crafted phishing email, presented to the right person at the right moment, is more effective than most technical attacks. Spear phishing, as mentioned earlier, applies social engineering with specific knowledge of the target. The email references the target by name. It appears to come from someone the target knows and trusts. It refers to real, specific events, projects or concerns. The more specific and contextually accurate the email, the more convincing it is. Advanced persistent threat actors, the nation-state and sophisticated criminal groups spend significant time on reconnaissance, gathering information about targets from LinkedIn, company websites, social media, and other public sources before crafting spear phishing emails. Business email compromise is a form of social engineering that does not involve malware at all. In business email compromise, the attacker impersonates a senior executive or a trusted vendor and sends emails to employees in the finance department asking them to transfer funds or change payment details. The email looks legitimate. It may come from a domain name that is very similar to the legitimate domain, with one character changed, such as using a 0 instead of the letter O, or adding an extra letter. These subtle differences are easy to miss when you are busy, and the request appears to come from a trusted authority. Business email compromise caused approximately $2.9 billion in losses reported to the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation in 2023 alone. Pretexting involves creating a false scenario, a pretext, to extract information or access from a target. An attacker calls an IT help desk pretending to be an employee who is locked out of their account. They provide enough personal details, gathered through research, to convince the help desk technician to reset the password. The help desk technician, trying to be helpful, does so. The attacker has gained access to the account. No malware was involved. No vulnerability was exploited. The system worked exactly as intended. The human element was exploited. Organizations address social engineering through security awareness training. Regular simulated phishing exercises send test phishing emails to employees and track who clicks. Those who click receive training. Over time, employees become more skeptical of unexpected emails asking them to take action. Multi-factor authentication, which requires a second form of verification beyond a password, limits the damage from credential theft. Even if an attacker captures a username and password through phishing, they cannot log in without the second factor, such as a code from a phone. But social engineering evolves. As phishing awareness has increased, attackers have adapted. Vishing, voice phishing conducted over phone calls, is effective because it is unexpected and requires a real-time response. Smishing, SMS phishing through text messages, exploits the fact that people are accustomed to clicking links in texts. QR code phishing embeds malicious links in QR codes, which are harder to preview before following than traditional hyperlinks. And now, artificial intelligence has entered this domain. Voice cloning technology can synthesize a convincing replica of a specific person's voice from a short audio sample. Deepfake video technology can generate realistic video of a person saying things they never said. Large language models can generate contextually appropriate, grammatically perfect, personally tailored phishing text at scale, eliminating the grammatical errors and awkward phrasing that used to be a telltale sign of phishing emails. In 2023, the chief financial officer of a multinational company in Hong Kong was manipulated into transferring $25 million to criminals. The attack used a video conference call in which the attacker had generated deepfake video of multiple members of the company's senior leadership team, appearing to give instructions for the transfer. The CFO thought they were on a legitimate video call with their colleagues. They were watching generated video of people who did not exist, or rather, of real people who were not present. This is where social engineering is going. The technical defenses are improving. The human defenses have limits, and the tools available to attackers are becoming more powerful by the year. Chapter 12: Modern Threats, AI Viruses, Cloud Attacks, and the Future. In 2025, the cybersecurity landscape bears only partial resemblance to what it looked like even 5 years ago. The fundamental technical principles of malware have not changed. Buffer overflows are still exploited. Social engineering is still used. Code still spreads by copying itself. But the sophistication, scale, and capabilities available to attackers have undergone a qualitative shift. And the most significant driver of that shift is artificial intelligence. According to Kaspersky's data, for the 12 months from November 2024 to October 2025, an average of approximately 500,000 malicious files are detected every day. 500,000 every day. That is a rate significantly higher than previous periods. The volume of new malware being created is accelerating. The reason, in part, is that artificial intelligence tools are dramatically lowering the barrier to creating malware. Large language models, the same underlying technology that powers AI assistants, can be prompted to generate code. While mainstream AI systems have safety measures designed to prevent them from generating overtly malicious code, these measures are imperfect and can be bypassed through careful prompting. Darknet forums already offer AI tools specifically tuned to assist with malware development with no safety restrictions. Prompt lock, identified by security researchers in early 2025, was a proof-of-concept piece of ransomware that used a locally hosted large language model to dynamically generate its own malicious scripts during execution. Rather than having static payload code that could be detected by signature, PromptLock used AI to generate novel encryption scripts at runtime, making each infection functionally unique. The malware targeted Windows, Linux, and Mac OS systems simultaneously. While assessed as a proof of concept rather than a fully weaponized tool, it demonstrated a capability that previously existed only in theory. AI-assisted malware offers several advantages to attackers. It can generate novel code that has no prior signatures, defeating signature-based detection. It can write code in multiple programming languages, making analysis harder. It can adapt its behavior based on the environment it finds itself in, becoming more context-aware. And AI can assist with the social engineering component, generating convincing phishing text, voice, and video content at scale. The defensive side of this arms race also involves AI. Modern endpoint detection products use machine learning models trained on hundreds of millions of malware samples to identify malicious code based on structural and behavioral features. These models can identify novel malware that has never been seen before by recognizing patterns that characterize malicious code, even in unfamiliar forms. But as attacker AI improves, defensive AI must keep pace. The question of which side benefits more from AI is genuinely open. Cloud infrastructure has become a primary attack target. Modern organizations run significant portions of their technology infrastructure in cloud computing platforms like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. These platforms provide virtual servers, storage, databases, and application services. A compromise of cloud infrastructure can expose data from many different customers simultaneously because cloud platforms are multi-tenant, serving multiple organizations on shared hardware. A misconfigured cloud storage bucket, where the access permissions are set incorrectly to allow public access, can expose enormous amounts of sensitive data without any malware being involved at all. The attack is simply knowing where to look. Supply chain attacks represent a particularly insidious attack vector that has received increasing attention following several high-profile incidents. A supply chain attack targets not the final victim, but the software or hardware the victim uses. If an attacker can compromise a widely used software library, a development tool, or a software update mechanism, they can deliver malware to every organization that uses the compromised software. The SolarWinds attack of 2020 is the canonical example of a sophisticated supply chain attack. SolarWinds makes a widely used IT management software product called Orion. Attackers, believed to be Russian government intelligence operatives, gained access to SolarWinds' development environment and inserted malicious code into a software update for Orion. The update was cryptographically signed by SolarWinds using their legitimate certificate. Organizations that installed the update received the malware as a trusted, signed, legitimate update from their own software vendor. Approximately 18,000 organizations installed the compromised update. The attackers used it to gain access to selected high-value targets, including multiple United States federal government agencies, major corporations, and security companies. The operation went undetected for approximately 9 months. The supply chain attack demonstrates a frightening principle. Organizations spend enormous resources defending their own perimeter, but they must trust the software they run. If that software is compromised at the source, the organization's perimeter defenses provide no protection whatsoever. The attack comes from inside, disguised as a trusted update. Firmware attacks represent another frontier. Firmware is the software embedded directly in hardware devices, including network routers, storage controllers, network interface cards, BIOS chips, hard drive controllers, and many other components. Firmware runs below the operating system, with total access to the hardware. Malware that compromises firmware can persist through complete reinstallations of the operating system, through hard drive replacements, through all the standard remediation techniques. The only way to remove firmware malware is to reflash the firmware itself, which requires knowing that the firmware is infected, which is very difficult to detect because the firmware operates at a level below most detection tools. Firmware attacks have been documented in intelligence agency toolsets, notably in documents released by WikiLeaks describing CIA capabilities and in state-sponsored malware frameworks. They are the most persistent form of malware currently known to exist. An organization infected at the firmware level may believe they have cleaned their systems when they have not. The malware is in the hardware itself. The Internet of Things, meaning the expanding universe of Internet-connected devices that are not traditional computers, has created an enormous new attack surface. Security cameras, smart televisions, home routers, industrial sensors, medical devices, smart home controllers, automobiles, all of these are computers running software and connected to networks. Many of them run versions of Linux or other operating systems with known vulnerabilities. Many of them are never updated after purchase. Many of them are accessible from the Internet, and their security is often dramatically inferior to that of traditional computers. The Mirai botnet, discovered in 2016, demonstrated the threat. Mirai infected Internet-connected cameras and routers by scanning for devices using default factory usernames and passwords. It tried combinations like admin/password and root/password. Enormous numbers of devices had never had their passwords changed. Mirai infected hundreds of thousands of these devices, creating a botnet of astonishing scale. It then used this botnet to conduct a denial-of-service attack against Dyn, a company that provided DNS services for a large portion of the Internet. The attack knocked major websites including Twitter, Reddit, Netflix, Spotify, and PayPal offline for hours. The attack was conducted by a botnet of webcams and home routers. As more devices connect to the Internet, the attack surface expands. A smart insulin pump that can be remotely administered. A pacemaker with Bluetooth connectivity. An automobile whose software can be updated over the air. All of these have been demonstrated to have exploitable vulnerabilities. The consequences of exploiting such devices in a medical context could be fatal. Chapter 13. The Legal and Ethical Landscape. The story of computer viruses is not just a technical story. It is a legal story, an ethical story, and a geopolitical story. And these dimensions deserve examination. The legal framework around computer crime varies significantly by jurisdiction. In the United States, the primary federal law is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, which was updated multiple times. The law criminalizes unauthorized access to computer systems, distribution of malware, and related activities. Penalties can be severe, including lengthy prison sentences. But enforcement against sophisticated actors, particularly those operating from foreign countries, is extremely difficult. International attribution of cyber attacks is technically challenging and politically complex. When a piece of malware is discovered, forensic analysis of the code can reveal indicators of its origin, the programming languages and coding styles used, the compilers used to build the code, which leave characteristic patterns in the binary, leftover debugging symbols or strings in non-English languages, shared code or infrastructure with previously identified malware, timestamps indicating when the code was compiled and in what time zone, operational security mistakes that reveal infrastructure details. These indicators, combined with intelligence from other sources, allow governments to attribute attacks to specific actors with varying degrees of confidence. However, sophisticated actors take steps to reduce attribution. They use infrastructure in third countries. They deliberately insert false flags, code characteristics suggesting a different country's origin. They use tools stolen from other groups. Attribution is probabilistic, not certain, and is as much a political and intelligence matter as a technical one. Nation-state cyber attacks occupy a legal grey zone. Traditional international law governs armed conflict. A missile strike on another country is an act of war with clear legal implications. But a cyber attack that destroys industrial equipment? The Tallinn Manual, an academic study of international law as it applies to cyber operations, published by NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, attempts to apply existing international law to cyber conflict. Its conclusions are nuanced and contested. When does a cyber attack rise to the level of an armed attack, justifying a military response? How do the rules of war regarding proportionality, distinction between military and civilian targets, and necessity apply to cyber operations? These questions do not yet have settled answers. The ethical questions around vulnerability research and disclosure are also contested. Security researchers who discover vulnerabilities face a choice. They can report the vulnerability privately to the affected vendor, allowing the vendor to fix it before it is exploited. They can publish it publicly without notifying the vendor, which may prompt faster fixes but also immediately exposes users to exploitation. They can sell it to governments or other buyers, which may mean it gets used as a weapon rather than fixed. They can keep it secret and use it themselves. The responsible disclosure norm, also called coordinated disclosure, suggests that researchers should notify the vendor and give them a reasonable time to develop and release a fix before publishing publicly. Most major technology companies have formal vulnerability disclosure programs that accept reports from external researchers and often pay bounties for valid findings. Google Project Zero, the NSA, and many other organizations both conduct and receive vulnerability research. The market for zero-day vulnerabilities is real and operates both openly and covertly. Legitimate companies like Zerodium have published pricing structures for vulnerabilities in various software products, paying hundreds of thousands to millions of US dollars for high-quality 0 days in widely used products. Governments are significant buyers, using these vulnerabilities for intelligence gathering and offensive operations. The existence of this market creates a conflict of interest. If vulnerabilities are more valuable as weapons than as fixed bugs, The economic incentive points toward keeping them secret rather than reporting them. This leaves users exposed. The NotPetya attack was enabled in part by Eternal Blue, an NSA-developed exploit that was subsequently stolen and leaked. The NSA had known about the vulnerability in Windows that Eternal Blue exploited for years before it was stolen. They had used it for intelligence operations. They had not notified Microsoft. When it leaked and was incorporated into WannaCry and NotPetya, the consequences were global and severe. The decision to hold the vulnerability as an offensive tool rather than report it for patching contributed directly to billions of dollars in damage and disruption to critical infrastructure, including hospitals treating patients. This is the fundamental tension in government offensive cyber capability. To use a vulnerability offensively, you must keep it secret. To protect citizens who use the vulnerable software, you must report it and allow it to be fixed. You cannot do both. The intelligence community calls this the equities process, weighing the offensive value of a vulnerability against the defensive value of patching it. Critics argue that in the case of Eternal Blue, the equities were assessed incorrectly, with catastrophic consequences. Chapter 14. How to Protect Yourself. The Science of Defense. We have spent this documentary examining how computer viruses work, how they infect, how they spread, how they hide, and how they cause damage. Now let us address the science of protection. What actually works in measurable, documented ways. Patching is the single most impactful defensive measure. The overwhelming majority of successful cyber attacks exploit known vulnerabilities, meaning vulnerabilities that have already been identified and for which patches, which are software updates that fix the vulnerability, are available. The WannaCry attack exploited a vulnerability for which Microsoft had released a patch more than a month before the attack. Organizations that had applied the patch were not affected. Organizations that had not applied the patch were devastated. Keeping operating systems and all software updated with security patches eliminates the vast majority of attack surface. Multi-factor authentication is the second most impactful measure. The majority of account compromises involve stolen or guessed passwords. Multi-factor authentication requires a second form of verification, typically a one-time code generated by an authenticator application on a phone, sent via SMS, or provided by a physical hardware token. An attacker who has stolen a password cannot log in without the second factor. Even credential phishing, where a fake website captures a username and password, is defeated if the attacker also needs a one-time code that expires within seconds. Major platforms including Google, Microsoft, and most financial institutions support multi-factor authentication. Enabling it is free and takes minutes. Principle of least privilege means giving each user and each program only the access they need to do their job, and no more. A user who works in marketing does not need administrative access to the company's financial systems. An application that handles user photos does not need access to the operating system's network configuration. When malware compromises an account or a process with limited privileges, the damage it can cause is proportionally limited. If it compromises an account with administrative privileges, it can do anything. Network segmentation divides a network into separate zones with controlled traffic between them. If an attacker gains a foothold in one zone, they cannot automatically reach every other part of the network. They must penetrate each segment individually. Critical systems, such as industrial control systems, financial transaction systems, and backup infrastructure, should be in separately protected network zones. Offline backups are the ultimate defense against ransomware. If you have a complete, recent, verified copy of all your data stored offline, a ransomware attack that encrypts your online systems can be recovered from by restoring from backup. The offline backup must be disconnected from the network because ransomware will encrypt network-accessible backups as well as primary data. The backup must be recent enough that the data loss from the point of backup to the point of attack is acceptable. And the backup must be tested, meaning you must have confirmed that you can actually restore from it, because an untested backup is of unknown reliability. Endpoint detection and response software, abbreviated EDR, is a significant upgrade from traditional antivirus. EDR products continuously monitor endpoint activity, recording a complete log of what every process does. They apply behavioral analytics to detect malicious activity. They can detect fileless malware that does not appear as files on disk. They can detect lateral movement, the process of spreading through a network after initial compromise. They provide security teams with detailed forensic information about what happened during an incident, making investigation faster and more complete. User education and awareness training demonstrably reduces the success rate of phishing attacks. Organizations that regularly conduct simulated phishing exercises and provide training to users who fail see significantly lower rates of real phishing success over time. Users who have been trained to be skeptical of unexpected emails, to verify requests through a separate communication channel, and to report suspicious messages to security teams provide an active layer of defense that technology alone cannot replicate. Zero Trust architecture is a security framework based on the principle of never trust. Always verify. Traditional security models assumed that everything inside the corporate network perimeter was trusted and everything outside was untrusted. Zero Trust removes the concept of a trusted network. Every access request, regardless of where it comes from, is verified before being granted. Every user must authenticate. Every device must be verified to be in a good security state. Every application access is checked against policy. Even an authenticated user on a corporate laptop inside the corporate network must prove they should have access to each specific resource they request. This model dramatically limits the damage an attacker can cause after gaining initial access, because lateral movement requires defeating the access controls at every step. Chapter 15. The Future, Quantum Computing, AI Warfare, and what comes next. We are at an inflection point. The principles of computer viruses have been stable for decades. Self-replication, trigger conditions, payloads. But the technical environment in which these principles operate is changing faster than at any previous point in the history of computing. Several technologies on the horizon will fundamentally alter the threat landscape. Quantum computing represents the most profound potential disruption. Classical computers process information as bits, each bit being a 0 or a 1. Quantum computers use quantum bits, called qubits, which can exist in a superposition of 0 and 1 simultaneously, thanks to the quantum mechanical properties of the particles used to implement them. This allows quantum computers to explore multiple computational paths simultaneously and perform certain classes of computation exponentially faster than classical computers. The most significant security implication of quantum computing is its potential impact on cryptography. Modern cybersecurity depends heavily on cryptographic algorithms to protect data. Public key cryptography, the type used to secure internet connections, email encryption, digital signatures, and cryptocurrency, relies on mathematical problems that are computationally infeasible to solve with classical computers. The most widely used public key cryptography algorithms, including RSA and elliptic curve cryptography, depend on the difficulty of factoring very large numbers or solving the discrete logarithm problem. With sufficient qubits and error correction, a quantum computer running an algorithm called Shor's algorithm, discovered in 1994 by mathematician Peter Shor, could solve these problems efficiently. This would compromise the security of essentially all currently deployed public key cryptography. If a sufficiently powerful quantum computer were built, an attacker with access to it could, in principle, decrypt internet traffic that was encrypted with current algorithms, forge digital signatures, break certificate chains, and undermine the authentication mechanisms that secure cloud services, financial systems, and government networks. The implications for malware are significant. Malware that is currently blocked by certificate validation, which relies on cryptographic signatures, could potentially bypass that validation. Communications between malware and its command and control servers could potentially be decrypted by intelligence agencies with quantum capabilities, improving attribution and interdiction. But those same agencies could also use quantum capabilities offensively. The good news is that the security community has been aware of this threat for decades and has been working on post-quantum cryptography, which is cryptographic algorithms based on mathematical problems that are believed to be hard even for quantum computers. In 2022, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States completed a multi-year standardization process and selected 4 post-quantum cryptographic algorithms for standardization. The transition to these algorithms is underway, but will take years or decades to complete across all systems. AI-enabled malware is not a future threat. It is present now in early forms, as the prompt lock ransomware demonstrated. But the AI capabilities available in 2026 are primitive compared to what will exist in 5 to 10 years. Consider what becomes possible when AI systems are deeply integrated into malware. Autonomous vulnerability discovery. Current malware exploits vulnerabilities that human researchers or the malware authors have identified. Future AI-enabled malware could potentially discover its own vulnerabilities in real time, analyzing target software on the fly and identifying exploitable weaknesses. This would eliminate the current bottleneck in the attack cycle, which is finding and weaponizing a vulnerability. Context-aware evasion. Malware that can observe the security tools present on a target system and adapt its behavior to evade each one specifically, rather than using pre-programmed generic evasion techniques. If the target is running a specific EDR product, the malware identifies this, accesses known evasion techniques for that product, and applies them. Autonomous lateral movement. Malware that can navigate a corporate network, identify high-value targets, and move toward them intelligently, making decisions based on what it discovers, without requiring real-time human direction from the attacker. This removes the attacker as a bottleneck in the attack operation, allowing attacks to proceed at machine speed. Adversarial AI versus defensive AI. Security companies are deploying AI to detect malware. Malware is adapting to evade AI detection. This creates a new dimension of the arms race, operating at a level of abstraction above the traditional signature and evasion cycle. The battle will be fought between AI models, with security researchers training defensive models while attackers optimize adversarial inputs. The expansion of attack surface through the Internet of Things will continue. By 2030, estimates suggest there will be tens of billions of Internet-connected devices. Cars, medical implants, industrial sensors, smart city infrastructure. Each additional connected device is a potential entry point for an attacker. And the manufacturers of many of these devices do not have strong traditions of security engineering. They build consumer products, not military-grade secure systems. The gap between the threat environment and the security of everyday connected devices is wide and growing. Critical infrastructure attacks are an increasing concern. Power grids, water treatment systems, financial clearing systems, air traffic control, hospital networks all depend on computers. All run software. All have vulnerabilities. Attacks on critical infrastructure by nation-state actors are documented, ongoing, and increasing in sophistication. The question is not whether such infrastructure can be attacked. It can. The question is what the consequences would be and whether the defenders can respond fast enough to limit them. The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack of May 2021 demonstrated the potential consequences. A ransomware group called DarkSide infected the computer networks of Colonial Pipeline, which operates one of the largest fuel pipelines in the United States, supplying 45% of the fuel consumed on the East Coast. The company shut down its pipeline operations proactively to prevent the malware from spreading to the operational technology systems controlling the pipeline itself. The shutdown lasted nearly a week. Fuel shortages spread across the southeastern United States. Prices rose. Airports warned of fuel limitations. The US government declared a state of emergency. Colonial Pipeline paid approximately $4.4 million in ransom. The FBI subsequently recovered the majority of the payment by tracking the cryptocurrency. But the attack had demonstrated unambiguously that ransomware against critical infrastructure was a tool with national-scale consequences. The ransomware payment did not prevent harm in this case because the harm came from the shutdown rather than from data loss. Organizations that shut down operations to prevent ransomware from reaching operational technology face a dilemma. Paying does not restore what was lost. Not paying may result in data exposure. In either case, the operational disruption, while systems are investigated, cleaned, and restored, can be severe. Chapter 16. The Philosophy of Vulnerability. There is a deeper truth here that this documentary has been building toward, and it deserves to be stated directly. Every piece of software that has ever been written by a human being contains mistakes. This is not a bold claim. It is a mathematical certainty. Writing software is an activity that requires expressing enormously complex logic in a formal language. Human beings make mistakes. The complexity of modern software is so vast that even the most talented and careful engineers produce programs with defects. Some of those defects are security vulnerabilities. The Windows operating system contains hundreds of millions of lines of code. The Linux kernel contains tens of millions of lines of code. The Chrome browser contains tens of millions of lines of code. The firmware running inside the processors, the storage devices, the network interfaces, the BIOS, each contains millions of lines of code. Formal mathematical verification of software correctness, which involves proving using automated logic tools that a program behaves correctly for all possible inputs, exists but is currently practical only for relatively small programs. It cannot be applied to operating systems of the scale we use today. Every vulnerability that has ever been exploited by a computer virus was a bug in software written by human beings. The buffer overflow that Morris Worm exploited was a bug. The 4 0 days that Stuxnet used were bugs. Eternal Blue was a bug in Windows SMB implementation. The vulnerability that allowed Configure to spread was a bug. Every successful cyber attack in history was enabled by a bug. This is both reassuring and terrifying. It is reassuring because it means the vulnerability is not some fundamental property of computation itself. It is a property of human-written software. Better software engineering practices, better programming languages with stronger safety guarantees, better security review processes, formal verification where applicable, all can reduce the number of vulnerabilities. Progress is possible and has been made. It is terrifying because the volume of software in the world is increasing, not decreasing. Every new application, every new device, every new cloud service adds more code. The total surface area of software that could contain vulnerabilities is growing faster than the improvements in security. And as the complexity of systems increases, the interactions between components create new categories of vulnerability that arise not from bugs in individual components, but from unexpected interactions between components that are each individually correct. The arms race between attackers and defenders is not converging toward a solution. It is continuing indefinitely at increasing levels of sophistication. The attackers need only find one exploitable flaw. The defenders need to secure everything. The asymmetry fundamentally favors the attacker. This asymmetry is not unique to computer security. It is a general property of any attack and defense scenario where the attacker chooses the time, place, and method of attack, while the defender must be prepared everywhere at all times. Medieval castle designers faced the same asymmetry. Modern physical security engineers face the same asymmetry. But in the digital domain, the scale is global. The speed is near instantaneous, the cost of an attack is low relative to the potential gain, and the attacker can attempt the same attack against millions of targets simultaneously. Chapter 17. The Human Cost. It is easy in a discussion of technical mechanisms to lose sight of the fact that these attacks cause real harm to real people. Let us be specific about that. When the NHS was hit by WannaCry, patients had their non-emergency procedures cancelled. People waited longer for diagnosis. The harm was statistical and diffuse, but it was real. No one can say with certainty that someone died because of WannaCry's effects on the NHS. But when medical care is disrupted, outcomes worsen. The harm happened. Hospitals have been targeted by ransomware with lethal implications. In 2020, a ransomware attack hit Düsseldorf University Hospital in Germany. Systems went down. A patient requiring emergency treatment was diverted to another hospital farther away. German prosecutors investigated whether the delay contributed to the patient's death. The case raised the possibility for the first time in documented history that a cyber attack had directly caused a human death. The investigation was ultimately inconclusive on direct causation, but the chain of events was clear. Ransomware attacks on healthcare institutions continue. According to the American Hospital Association, hospitals in the United States experienced more than 650 significant cyber attack incidents in 2023. For each incident, patients faced delays, diversions, and disruptions in care. Medical devices may go offline. Patient record systems may be unavailable. Surgical schedules may be disrupted. The cumulative human cost, expressed in delayed diagnoses, treatment delays, and compromised care, is real even when it is invisible. For individual victims of data theft, the harm can be lasting. Identity theft resulting from stolen personal data can take years to resolve. The victim may find fraudulent accounts opened in their name, fraudulent tax returns filed, fraudulent medical claims made. Each incident requires extensive effort to investigate and resolve. Credit ratings are damaged. Loan applications are denied. The financial and emotional burden on individuals is significant. For small businesses hit by ransomware, the consequences can be terminal. A small business with 10 employees, no IT department, and no cyber insurance that faces a ransomware demand of $100,000 may simply not survive. The ransom may exceed the business's liquid assets. Even if the ransom is paid, the time lost, the data lost, the reputational damage from informing customers, and the cost of rebuilding systems may exceed what the business can absorb. Tens of thousands of small businesses have closed as a result of ransomware attacks. These human costs are the reason this subject matters. Computer viruses are not an abstract technical curiosity. They are tools that cause harm to people, to institutions, and to societies. Understanding how they work is not just intellectually interesting. It is practically important for everyone who uses technology, which means everyone. Chapter 18. The Global Arms Race. Today, in 2026, virtually every major nation-state has an offensive cyber program. The United States Cyber Command conducts offensive operations. The United Kingdom's GCHQ has a dedicated offensive unit called the National Offensive Cyber Program. Russia's GRU and FSB operate sophisticated cyber teams. China's People's Liberation Army has dedicated cyber units, particularly Unit 61398, which has been publicly named and indicted by the United States Department of Justice for economic cyber espionage. North Korea's Lazarus Group conducts both espionage and financially motivated attacks, funding the regime through cryptocurrency theft. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has offensive cyber capabilities. And beyond these well-documented programs, dozens of other nations maintain varying levels of offensive cyber capability. The malware these programs develop represents the most sophisticated software ever written for offensive purposes. Nation-state malware often goes undiscovered for years. The Equation Group malware, later attributed to the NSA, had been operating undiscovered for at least 14 years before being publicly revealed by Kaspersky Lab in 2015. The malware used techniques that were years ahead of anything previously known to exist, including firmware infection capabilities for hard drives that survived complete drive wipes. The militarization of cyberspace has proceeded rapidly and with minimal governance. There are no international treaties governing the use of cyber weapons equivalent to the Geneva Conventions for Kinetic Warfare. There are no binding norms around what constitutes a proportionate response to a cyber attack. There is no international monitoring body with the authority to investigate cyber attacks and attribute them. The Tallinn Manual, developed by NATO, provides a scholarly framework but has no legal force. Nations are essentially free to conduct whatever cyber operations they choose, constrained only by their own policies, the risk of escalation, and the technical capabilities of the target. The United Nations has had discussions about cyber norms, producing non-binding reports recommending that nations not attack critical infrastructure in peacetime. The practical effect of these recommendations on nation-state behavior is limited. The evidence suggests that critical infrastructure attacks continue, attributed to state actors without meaningful consequence. The Colonial Pipeline attack and numerous other attacks on critical infrastructure have occurred without the attributed nation-states facing significant diplomatic or economic consequences. Cyber deterrence, the concept that the threat of retaliation should deter attacks, faces fundamental challenges. Attribution is uncertain enough that an attacker may calculate they can deny responsibility. The severity of a cyber attack is often unclear until it's fully investigated. The speed of cyber attacks makes escalation management difficult, and the line between an act of war and a criminal operation, particularly when criminal groups are allowed to operate by states that tacitly approve their targets, is deliberately blurred. Conclusion. The endless war. In today's documentary, we began with a simple question. How does a computer virus work? The answer, as we have seen, is not simple. A computer virus works by exploiting the most fundamental properties of computing itself. The fact that code and data occupy the same medium. The fact that software is written by human beings who make mistakes. The fact that complex systems interacting with each other create vulnerabilities that no individual component exposes. The fact that the human mind can be manipulated. The fact that trust, which is the foundation of all communication systems, can be abused. A computer virus is a kind of question. It asks, are the people who built this system as clever as I am? Across the history of computer viruses, the answer has been yes, sometimes. No, sometimes. And sometimes the question was too cleverly framed for the defenders to even understand it was being asked. What we have traced through this documentary is not just the technical history of malicious code. We have traced the evolution of human ingenuity applied to deception, to exploitation, to destruction, and to defense. From John von Neumann's theoretical self-reproducing automaton in 1949 to the AI-generated ransomware of 2025, the core dynamic has been constant. Someone finds a way to make code do something it should not do. Someone else finds a way to detect and stop it. The first person finds a way around the detection. The second person builds a better detector. And the cycle continues. The elk cloner of 1981 and the Stuxnet worm of 2010 share the same mathematical ancestor in von Neumann's work. They share the same fundamental architecture of infection mechanism, trigger, and payload. But the distance between a virus that displays a poem on a floppy disk computer and a weapon that destroys nuclear centrifuges is the distance between a bicycle and a supersonic jet. Both have wheels and wings. Neither is comparable in any way that matters for practical purposes. The trajectory is clear. Malware is becoming more sophisticated. Attacks are becoming more targeted. The integration of artificial intelligence is accelerating development on both sides. The attack surface is expanding as more devices connect to the internet and more critical infrastructure becomes computer-controlled. Nation-states have invested heavily in offensive capabilities while international governance lags far behind. And yet progress is also real. The security community has gotten dramatically better at detection, response, and prevention. Programming languages and development tools have improved in ways that eliminate entire classes of vulnerability. Hardware security features have made exploitation significantly harder than it was a decade ago. International law enforcement cooperation has resulted in significant disruptions to major criminal ransomware groups. The Colonial Pipeline ransom was partially recovered. The Lockbit ransomware group's infrastructure was seized in a coordinated international operation in 2024. Progress is real, but progress does not mean the war is being won. It means the terms of engagement are shifting. Every improvement in defense motivates a corresponding improvement in offense. Every criminal group taken down is replaced by others. Every vulnerability patched reveals new ones in its place. The computer you are reading this on, or the phone in your pocket, is an extraordinarily complex machine running software written by thousands of people. That software has bugs. Some of those bugs are security vulnerabilities. Some of those vulnerabilities are known to attackers who have chosen not to disclose them. Some of them are known to no one yet. And every day, somewhere in the world, someone is searching for new ones. This is not cause for paralysis. It is cause for awareness. The most effective defense against computer viruses in the real world that most people inhabit is not a sophisticated technical tool. It is understanding. Understanding that software has vulnerabilities, so you keep it updated. Understanding that email can be deceptive, so you verify before you click. Understanding that backup is essential, so you maintain offline copies of what matters to you. Understanding that authentication can be stolen, so you use multi-factor authentication. Understanding that the person asking you to open that file may not be who they appear to be. A computer virus is, at its most fundamental level, a sequence of instructions, nothing more. Instructions expressed as binary digits, zeros and ones. But those zeros and ones, arranged with sufficient cleverness, are capable of crossing air gaps, of destroying industrial machinery, of holding hospitals hostage, of stealing the financial foundations of ordinary lives, of altering the course of nuclear programs, and potentially of geopolitical history. This is what mathematics can do. This is what human ingenuity applied to its darkest purposes can create. And this is why, for as long as we depend on software, understanding how computer viruses work is not just a matter of academic interest. It is a matter of survival.